You don't belong in my cockpit. I don't have time for passenger pleasantries.
Please, let's
The
remain
words
professional.
hung in the air like exhaust fumes, toxic and unmistakable.
Gentlemen, maintain your
Captain
focus.
Ethan
We're on
Blackwell
schedule.
didn't even look up from his pre-flight checklist as he dismissed the elegantly dressed black woman standing at his cockpit door. His voice carried the casual arrogance of a man who believed altitude somehow granted him altitude. What he didn't know was that in exactly 72 hours, that same woman would sit across from him in the company boardroom and end his career with the same cold precision he'd just shown her. The woman he refused to acknowledge wasn't just another passenger seeking a
Please,
cockpit
let's
tour.
remain professional.
She was Dr. Victoria Simmons, retired Air Force Colonel Aerospace Engineer and the newest member of Apex Airlines Board of Directors, sent specifically to evaluate him. Before we dive deeper into this story of arrogance and accountability, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe that respect should never be optional, even at 40,000 feet, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. This is a story everyone in a position of power needs to hear. The skies might be boundless, but as Captain Blackwell was about to discover, privilege has its limits. And sometimes justice wears comfortable shoes and travels in economy before delivering its verdict from the boardroom. Ethan Blackwell was the undisputed master of his domain. For 22 years, he had commanded aircraft with technical perfection that even his harshest critics couldn't deny. His record spoke for itself: over 16,000 flight hours, 0 incidents, certified on 6 different aircraft types, and the youngest pilot in Apex Airlines history to command their flagship routes. At 42, his uniform was always immaculate, 4 silver stripes gleaming against midnight blue, the gold wings above his breast pocket polished to a mirror shine. His graying temples added gravitas to piercing blue eyes that rarely softened. He didn't just fly planes. He commanded them as if the massive Boeing 787 Dreamliner was an extension of his will, rather than an engineering marvel requiring careful management. Pre-flight checklist Rivera Ethan ordered as he strode through Terminal 4 at JFK International. First Officer James Rivera, 32, followed precisely half a step behind tablet already open to the day's flight plan. Yes, Captain. Weather over the Atlantic looks choppy but manageable. We've got a full flight, 284 passengers, 12 crew, fuel load calculated with the extra reserve you requested. James was everything Ethan valued in a first officer: technically proficient, meticulous, and, most importantly, deferential. 6 years with Apex, James had risen quickly through the ranks, his Hispanic heritage making him a perfect corporate poster child for diversity initiatives. But behind his careful professionalism lay something Ethan couldn't quite read. A thoughtfulness that occasionally bordered on hesitation, which Ethan interpreted as weakness. Good morning, Captain Blackwell. First Officer Rivera. Beautiful day for flying. Ethan barely glanced at her, his eyes already scanning the departure screen. Terminal forecast for London. The system's showing potential crosswinds. I'll get that for you right away, sir. Melissa replied, her smile dimming slightly as she turned to her terminal. James nodded apologetically at Melissa when Ethan wasn't looking. This was the unspoken routine, Ethan's brusque efficiency leaving small relational casualties that James quietly tried to repair. The captain's pre-flight ritual was legendary among Apex staff, a precise, almost religious sequence that brooked no interruption. From his arrival exactly 90 minutes before departure to his last system check before pushback, every movement was choreographed with surgical precision. Flight attendants knew to stay clear, ground crew learned to have everything ready, and gate agents prepared all documentation in advance. My father taught me something when I was learning to fly. Ethan once told a company newsletter for a profile they'd written against his wishes. He said, "Son in the air, there's no room for democracy. A cockpit has one captain for a reason." His father retired. Captain William Blackwell had been one of commercial aviation's living legends, a former Air Force test pilot who had flown everything from experimental jets to the first generation of jumbo jets. The Blackwell name carried weight in aviation circles, and Ethan had spent his career simultaneously honoring and escaping that shadow. As they entered the aircraft, Sophia Mendez, the lead flight attendant, greeted them warmly. At 35, Sophia was a consummate professional with 12 years at Apex. Her neatly pressed uniform and calm demeanor masked an exceptional ability to read people, a skill honed through thousands of hours managing passengers and crew in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. "Good morning, Captain Blackwell. First Officer Rivera. Cabin prep is underway and we're expecting a smooth boarding process." Ethan nodded curtly and proceeded directly to the cockpit without replying. James paused momentarily. "Thanks, Sophia. How's your son doing with those college applications?" Her face brightened. "He just got accepted to Cornell engineering program. That's fantastic. Tell him congratulations from me." "Will do. How's the captain today?" she asked quietly, her eyes flicking toward the cockpit. James gave a small shrug that conveyed volumes. "Standard operating procedure." Inside the cockpit, Ethan was already in his element. This was his sanctuary, a symphony of switches, screens, and systems that responded to his touch with perfect obedience. Here, unlike the messy world of human interaction, everything followed logical rules. Everything had its place and every problem had a solution. "Rivera, verify the performance calculations. I want to double-check those takeoff speeds." "Already on it, Captain." Ethan began his methodical inspection of every instrument, every display, his fingers dancing across panels with practiced precision. For him, the sterile cockpit wasn't just an aviation regulation limiting non-essential conversation during critical phases of flight. It was a philosophy, a way of life. Human variables were complications to be minimized. Technical excellence was the only standard that mattered. What he didn't realize was that this philosophy was about to be put to the ultimate test, not by mechanical failure or bad weather, but by the simplest of human courtesies, or rather, his failure to extend it. Boarding had commenced smoothly, the business class cabin filling with the usual mix of frequent flyers and corporate travelers. The familiar rhythm of the pre-departure process unfolded precisely as it had thousands of times before. Overhead bins closed with soft thuds, passengers settled into their seats with varying degrees of expertise, and the cabin filled with the white noise of muted conversations and shuffling carry-ons. Dr. Victoria Simmons boarded with Group 2 moving with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to navigating spaces with purpose. At 58, she carried herself with the straight-backed posture that 2 decades in the Air Force had instilled. Her hair was styled in elegant silver-streaked locks that framed a face marked by intelligence and careful observation. She wore a simple navy blazer over a cream blouse, tailored gray slacks, and comfortable but sophisticated flats clothing chosen deliberately to be neither flashy nor forgettable. As a board member conducting an undercover evaluation, Victoria had purposely booked a business class seat. The Phoenix Initiative, as Chairman Alexander Harrington had named it, required authentic observation of crew behavior toward regular passengers, not VIPs who received special treatment. Victoria settled into seat 3A, but rather than immediately immersing herself in a device like most passengers, she simply observed. She watched how Sophia directed the boarding process, noting her professionalism and warm interactions with passengers. She observed how James occasionally emerged from the cockpit to check on various items, always with a respectful word for the cabin crew. 15 minutes before scheduled departure, Victoria rose and approached the open cockpit door. It was a calculated move, the perfect moment to test how the flight crew responded to a passenger's simple greeting during their pre-flight procedures. She paused at the threshold visible to both pilots. James looked up immediately, offering a friendly smile. "Good morning, gentlemen," Victoria said warmly. "Looks like a beautiful day to fly." James nodded politely. "Good morning, ma'am. It certainly is. Should be a smooth flight once we get past some weather over the Atlantic." Captain Blackwell didn't turn around. He continued methodically programming the flight management system, his back a wall of deliberate indifference. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Victoria remained standing there, her presence a challenge to his self-imposed isolation. "I'm looking forward to a safe journey in your capable hands," she added, her voice clear and pleasant. The cockpit remained silent except for the soft beeps of equipment and Ethan's typing. After another moment, without turning his head, Ethan spoke sharply. "First Officer Rivera, secure the door. We're completing critical pre-flight checks." The dismissal was unmistakable, cold, unnecessary, and laden with contempt. James's face flushed slightly with embarrassment. "Yes, Captain," he replied, then turned apologetically to Victoria. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We do need to complete our procedures." Victoria's expression revealed nothing, but her eyes registered everything. The captain's deliberate snub, James's discomfort, the unnecessary harshness of the interaction. She nodded graciously to James. "Of course. Thank you, First Officer." As she turned away, she noticed Sophia standing nearby, having witnessed the entire exchange. The flight attendant's professional smile remained fixed, but her eyes conveyed silent apology. Victoria returned to her seat, removed a small leather-bound notebook from her bag, and made a brief notation. The first evaluation point had been recorded, and Captain Blackwell had failed spectacularly. What she didn't write down, what she didn't need to write down, was how familiar that dismissal felt. After decades in military and corporate aviation, Dr. Victoria Simmons had encountered countless Ethan Blackwells. Men who viewed their technical competence as permission to discard basic humanity, who mistook arrogance for authority, who never learned that command isn't just given by rank, it's earned through respect. The cabin door closed with a pressurized thunk, sealing them all in for the 7-hour journey across the Atlantic. For the passengers, it was the start of a routine flight. For Captain Ethan Blackwell, though he didn't know it yet, the countdown to his professional reckoning had begun. As the heavy cockpit door sealed with a metallic click, James settled back into the first officer's seat, an uncomfortable tension hanging in the recycled air. He hesitated, then decided to address what had just happened. "She was just being friendly, Ethan," he said carefully, keeping his tone neutral as he began his instrument checks. Ethan finally turned to look at him, his blue eyes cold. "This aircraft carries 284 lives across an ocean, Rivera. Our job is to fly it safely, not to entertain passengers or engage in pointless small talk. Professional distance isn't optional, it's essential." He turned back to the center console, adjusting the radio frequency with precise, deliberate movements. "The sterile cockpit isn't just a regulation, it's a mindset. The moment we start treating this flight deck like a social club is the moment we compromise safety." James absorbed this lecture silently. It wasn't the first time he'd heard Ethan's philosophy, but something about the unnecessary harshness toward a polite passenger struck him as extreme, even for Blackwell. "I understand maintaining professionalism," James replied carefully, but acknowledging a passenger's greeting doesn't compromise safety. Ethan's jaw tightened. "When I want your opinion on crew resource management, I'll ask for it. Complete the pre-departure checklist." The conversation was over, not resolved, simply terminated by the captain's authority. James focused on his tasks, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Throughout his training, he'd been taught that effective cockpit leadership involved creating an atmosphere where communication flowed freely, where junior officers felt empowered to speak up, where every crew member was valued. Captain Blackwell's cockpit was the opposite, a hierarchical space where his word was absolute and questioning was viewed as insubordination. Technical excellence without emotional intelligence. Authority without accessibility. The engines spooled up with a familiar rising whine as they prepared to push back from the gate. Ethan ran through the checklist with flawless precision, his hands moving across the controls with the confidence of thousands of repetitions. "Before start, checklist complete," James confirmed. "Ground Apex 101 ready for pushback." Ethan radioed, his voice shifting to the clear, measured cadence he used for air traffic communications. As the aircraft began its backward roll away from the terminal, Ethan was in his element. Here, surrounded by technology and procedure, everything made sense. The messiness of human interaction fell away, replaced by the pure logic of aerodynamics and physics. This was where he felt most alive, most in control, not just of the aircraft, but of his environment, his destiny. In business class, Victoria observed the smooth pushback feeling, the subtle shift as the massive aircraft began to move. She made another note in her journal, not about the technical operation, which was flawless, but about what she had witnessed in those brief moments at the cockpit door. She had spent decades evaluating pilots, first as an Air Force training officer, then as a safety consultant, and now as a board member. She had learned that how a pilot handled small human interactions often predicted how they would handle larger crises. Arrogance and dismissiveness weren't just personality flaws, they were operational liabilities. The Phoenix Initiative wasn't merely about catching bad behavior. It was about identifying a pattern that Alexander Harrington and other board members had begun to notice: a growing disconnect between technical excellence and leadership quality among senior pilots, particularly on premier routes. Customer complaints about crew arrogance had increased 43% over the past 18 months, with the highest concentration on flagship international flights like this one. Victoria hadn't been chosen randomly for this evaluation. As the newest board member, she brought a unique perspective, decorated military service engineering expertise, and as a black woman in aviation, first-hand experience with the subtle and not-so-subtle ways bias manifested in the industry. The massive Dreamliner accelerated down the runway engines at full thrust before pitching up into the morning sky. As the landing gear retracted with a reassuring thunk, passengers felt the familiar sensation of weight and gravity as the aircraft climbed steeply. In the cockpit, Ethan performed each maneuver with textbook perfection. His hands moved confidently across the controls, adjusting thrust monitoring systems communicating with ATC. This was his domain, where his skill was unquestionable, where the complexity of the machine met the capability of the man. What he couldn't see, what his instruments couldn't measure, was that his professional fate was now tied to something beyond his technical mastery. Something he had dismissed as irrelevant was about to become the most relevant factor in his career. 3 weeks earlier, in the wood-paneled boardroom on the 47th floor of Apex Airlines headquarters, Alexander Harrington had called the emergency session to order with grave concern etched on his face. "The numbers aren't lying to us," he said, his normally commanding voice subdued as he gestured toward the presentation screen. "Customer satisfaction on our premier routes has dropped 17% in the past year, despite on-time performance improvements." Around the polished oak table board, members studied the data with varying degrees of alarm. The charts showed a disturbing pattern. While Apex's technical performance metrics remained industry-leading, passenger experience ratings were in free fall. "What's driving this?" asked Leonard Walsh, the silver-haired CFO. "We've invested millions in new aircraft interiors, upgraded the meal service, improved the entertainment systems." Harrington clicked to the next slide. "It's not the planes or the amenities, it's the people." He highlighted a section of data, specifically passenger interactions with cockpit crew on long-haul routes. "Look at these complaint categories: dismissive, arrogant, condescending, unprofessional. And there's a troubling correlation with passenger demographics." The room fell silent as the implications settled in. Melissa Diaz, head of human resources, spoke first. "Are we talking about bias incidents?" "We're talking about a culture problem," Harrington replied, "one that's becoming a liability. Last quarter alone, we had 11 formal complaints about captain conduct that required legal review. 10 years ago, we averaged 2 per year." He straightened his tie, a nervous habit from his own days as a pilot. "This isn't just about customer service. It's about safety." Crews that don't communicate effectively, captains who create intimidating environments. These are preconditions for incidents. The boardroom door opened and Victoria Simmons entered precisely on time for her first meeting as the newest board member. Alexander had specifically recruited her. Her background in Air Force leadership engineering and aviation safety made her the perfect addition at this critical moment. Dr. Simmons. "Welcome," Harrington said, extending his hand. "We were just discussing our crew culture challenges." Victoria took her seat, her posture military straight even in the plush leather chair. "I've reviewed the preliminary data. The pattern is concerning but not unfamiliar." "What do you mean?" asked Diaz. "The aviation industry has always struggled with the gap between technical proficiency and leadership quality," Victoria explained. "Pilots are selected and promoted for their flying skills, not their people skills. We've created a system that rewards technical perfection, but often overlooks character defects, sometimes even enabling them." She opened her portfolio and distributed a document to each board member. "What you're seeing isn't unique to Apex, but your response to it could be." Alexander studied her proposal with growing interest. "The Phoenix Initiative," Victoria nodded. "A comprehensive evaluation program, not just reviewing data or customer complaints, but direct observation. Board members experiencing our service firsthand, anonymously evaluating our most senior captains in real operational environments." "You're suggesting we go undercover on our own flights?" Leonard looked skeptical. "I'm suggesting we see what our passengers see," Victoria corrected. "Data tells us what happened, but not how it felt. If we want to understand this problem, we need to experience it." Harrington considered this for a long moment. "Who would you start with?" Victoria didn't hesitate. "Captain Ethan Blackwell. Flagship route, impeccable technical record, but 7 formal complaints in the past year, 3 with potential bias implications. The perfect test case." Blackwell Melissa Diaz frowned. "He's being considered for the A380 fleet captain position. He's one of our most senior pilots." "Exactly," Victoria replied calmly. "If we're serious about culture change, we start at the top, not the bottom." Alexander's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "And who conducts this evaluation?" Victoria met his gaze steadily. "I will. As the newest board member, my face isn't known to the crew. As a former Air Force colonel, I understand the technical aspects. And as a black woman in aviation, I have first-hand experience with the behaviors we're trying to identify." The room fell silent as the board members exchanged glances. Finally, Alexander nodded decisively. "The Phoenix Initiative is approved. Dr. Simmons, you have full authority to conduct your evaluation. If Captain Blackwell passes, he strengthens his candidacy for the A380 position. If he fails," he let the implications hang in the air. "If he fails, Victoria finished for him. We've identified a problem before it becomes a crisis. And we send a clear message about what leadership really means at Apex Airlines." As the meeting adjourned, Victoria remained behind reviewing Ethan Blackwell's personnel file. 22 years of technical excellence, glowing evaluations from check pilots, perfect attendance record. But between these lines of praise were concerning notes, struggles with crew feedback, resistant to new procedures, communication issues with cabin crew. She turned to the complaints section. The most recent was from a female Japanese executive who reported that Blackwell had refused to acknowledge her when she thanked him upon deplaning, instead speaking only to her male colleague. Another from a black businessman who requested a cockpit visit for his aviation enthusiast son and was abruptly turned away while a white family was welcomed moments later. Each incident viewed in isolation could be explained away. Together they formed a pattern, one that Victoria had seen too many times before. Technical excellence being used as a shield for character flaws, rank being confused with respect, authority without accountability. She closed the file and made her decision. She would book herself on Blackwell's next transatlantic flight seated in business class. She would observe everything, his interactions, his decision-making, his leadership style. And she would do so, not as Dr. Victoria Simmons, board member, but as simply another passenger. What she didn't know then, couldn't have known, was that a routine weather system over the Atlantic was about to turn this evaluation into something far more revealing than a simple customer service check. Apex Flight 101 climbed steadily through 28,000 feet, the gentle banking turn toward its transatlantic track offering passengers on the left side a spectacular view of the Manhattan skyline receding in the distance. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the cabin crew began their service preparations. In the cockpit, Ethan and James settled into cruise routine. The complex dance of takeoff complete, they now faced the more mundane task of monitoring systems and navigating toward European airspace. Apex 101 contact New York Center on 128.75 came the instruction from Departure Control. 128.75 Apex 101, good day, James replied professionally. The radio handoff complete. Ethan rolled his shoulders slightly, the only sign of relaxation he ever showed in flight. Take the first break for lunch when Mason comes up, he told James, referring to the relief first officer who would rotate breaks with them on the long flight. James nodded, making a note on his tablet. Weather report shows that front over the Atlantic intensifying. Looks like we might hit some moderate chop around 3 hours in. Ethan studied the weather display, his eyes calculating. Nothing we haven't handled before. We'll stay at planned cruise level unless it builds significantly. The first hint of trouble came an hour into the flight. A yellow caution light illuminated on the EIKS engine indicating and crew alerting system. LGEN drive temp, it read, indicating elevated temperatures in the left engine's generator drive. James noticed it first. Captain, we've got an LGEN temperature alert. Ethan's eyes flicked to the display. Without a word, he pulled up the systems page and began methodically checking parameters. His movements were precise, unhurried, completely in control. Within limits, but trending up, he noted. Let's reduce power on the left engine by 3% and monitor. James reached for the QRH Quick Reference Handbook that contained the checklist for this scenario. Should I run the non-normal checklist for generator drive temperature? Ethan's expression hardened slightly. That's not necessary. It's a minor fluctuation, not a full exceedance. Keep monitoring it. The manual recommends running the checklist even for caution indicators, James noted carefully. It's standard procedure to... I'm familiar with the procedures. First Officer Ethan cut him off. I wrote some of them. This aircraft has known sensor issues in the LGEN that often present as false positives. Running unnecessary checklists creates more problems than it solves. James hesitated. His training had emphasized following procedures exactly, especially with caution indicators. But challenging Ethan directly would only create cockpit tension, and the temperature, while elevated, was still within operational limits. Yes, Captain. He conceded, but made a note of the time and exact reading, a small act of professional diligence that didn't go unnoticed by Ethan, whose jaw tightened slightly. In Seat 3A, Victoria observed a subtle change in engine pitch, the slight power reduction implemented by the cockpit. Most passengers wouldn't notice such a minor adjustment, but her engineering background and thousands of flight hours had attuned her ears to the aircraft's normal sounds. Something had changed, and the flight crew was responding to it. She made a note in her journal, but continued her observation of the cabin operation. Sophia was directing the meal service with quiet efficiency, her interactions with passengers personalized without being intrusive. When a young mother struggled with a fussy infant, Sophia stepped in with gentle assistance, creating a quiet space in the galley for her to calm the child. Victoria noticed something else, how the cabin crew's eyes occasionally flicked toward the cockpit door, with subtle apprehension. It was barely perceptible, but it spoke volumes about the atmosphere Ethan had created. They weren't just respectful of the captain, they were wary of him. 40 minutes after the initial alert, the cockpit door opened and Sophia appeared with the crew meals. Captain First Officer, your lunches, she said pleasantly, placing the trays carefully on the center console. Ethan barely acknowledged her presence, taking the tray without comment. James, however, looked up with a smile. "Thanks, Sophia. How's everything going back there?" "Very smooth. Though we have a passenger in 4C who's mentioned feeling unwell. Nothing serious yet. Just a headache, but I wanted to keep you informed." Ethan's response was immediate and dismissive. "That's a cabin issue, not a flight deck concern unless it becomes a medical emergency requiring diversion." Sophia's professional demeanor never wavered, but a flash of something resignation perhaps crossed her face. "Of course, Captain. Just following communication protocols." As she turned to leave, Ethan added, "And remind the cabin crew about unnecessary cockpit interruptions. We're monitoring a technical issue." The moment the door closed, James turned slightly toward Ethan. "She was just keeping us in the loop as procedures require." "Procedures don't require notifying us about every passenger headache," Ethan replied flatly. "That's the problem with the newer generation of pilots, Rivera. You confuse communication with distraction." James bit back his response. The newer generation comment stung at 32. He was hardly a novice with 6 years at Apex and nearly 5,000 hours in his logbook. But arguing would only make the situation worse. Instead, he redirected to the technical matter at hand. LGEN temperature has stabilized with the power reduction, still showing elevated but no longer increasing. Ethan nodded, satisfied with his own decision. "As expected. We'll maintain this power setting through the weather and reassess once we're in clearer air." The exchange highlighted everything that made Ethan both exceptional and problematic as a captain. His technical diagnosis had been spot on. The temperature issue was manageable with a simple power adjustment. His situational awareness was excellent, his decision-making confident. But his dismissal of both procedure and human communication revealed the fatal flaw in his leadership. He saw people as either assets or obstacles, never as collaborators. In row 3, Victoria finished her meal and continued her careful observations. The encounter with Sophia hadn't been visible to her, but she noticed the flight attendant's expression as she emerged from the cockpit, the carefully maintained professionalism masking something that looked very much like frustration. Victoria wrote in her notebook, "Crew interaction patterns suggest hierarchical environment rather than team atmosphere. Cabin crew appears hesitant when approaching flight deck. Possible communications barrier between cockpit and cabin safety implication." She couldn't know about the LGEN temperature issue specifically, but her decades of experience told her something was happening beyond normal cruise flight. The question was how the flight crew, particularly Captain Blackwell, would handle the challenges ahead. Outside the aircraft, the Atlantic weather system was intensifying clouds building into towering structures as conflicting air masses collided. What had been forecast as moderate turbulence was evolving into something more significant, and Captain Blackwell's decision-making was about to be tested in ways that would reveal far more than a simple cockpit greeting ever could. 3 hours into the flight, Apex 101 approached the weather system that had been building over the mid-Atlantic. On the cockpit weather radar, the storm front appeared as an angry mosaic of yellow and red stretching across their planned route like a barrier. Apex 101. Gander Center. The radio crackled with the distinctive accent of Canadian Air Traffic Control. "We're showing significant convective activity along your planned track. Multiple aircraft reporting severe turbulence between flight levels 320 and 380. Recommend deviation 20 degrees north for the next 100 nautical miles." James acknowledged the call while Ethan studied the radar intently, his expression calculating as he assessed the developing situation. "Roger, Gander. We'll evaluate and advise," James replied. Standard procedure for weather of this intensity was clear. Maintain at least 20 nautical miles separation from severe cells, deviate early rather than late, and prioritize passenger comfort and safety over schedule. The northerly deviation would add approximately 12 minutes to their flight time, but provide a much smoother ride. Ethan, however, had other ideas. "We're not deviating," he declared, his decision already made. "That route would burn extra fuel and the cells aren't directly in our path. We'll thread between the major buildups." James looked at the radar again, concern evident in his expression. The gaps between severe cells were narrow, and weather radar wasn't always precise at long ranges. What appeared as a gap could close quickly or contain turbulence not visible on their instruments. "Captain Gander is reporting severe turbulence and we've got other aircraft deviating," he said carefully. "Company policy recommends I know the policy," Ethan cut him off sharply. "I also know this aircraft and this route better than some controller in Gander. We have sufficient fuel and I'm not adding flight time for what's likely moderate chop at worst." His tone made it clear the decision was final. James faced the dilemma that first officers around the world confront daily: when to push back against a captain's decision and when to concede to experience and authority. The turbulence wouldn't compromise safety. In a structural sense, the 787 could handle far worse. But passenger comfort and potential injuries from unexpected motion were real concerns. "Captain, I recommend we inform the cabin crew about possible turbulence ahead," James suggested, finding middle ground. "Give them time to secure the cabin properly." Ethan nodded curtly. "Fine. Tell them we expect light to moderate turbulence. No need to alarm them." James frowned slightly at the deliberate understatement, but pressed the interphone button. "Cabin flight deck. We're approaching some weather and may experience turbulence in approximately 15 minutes. Please secure the cabin." In the main cabin, Sophia received the message and immediately began organizing her team. Victoria observed as the flight attendants efficiently moved through the aircraft, checking seat belts, securing loose items, and ensuring service carts were properly stowed. Sophia paused by Victoria's seat. "Ma'am, please make sure your seatbelt is fastened. We're expecting some bumpy air ahead." Victoria nodded, noting how Sophia was repeating the same warning to all passengers in her section, her manner calm but insistent. There was something in her expression, though a subtle concern, that suggested she might be reading between the lines of the cockpit's terse message. As Sophia moved on, Victoria glanced out her window. The sky ahead had transformed from clear blue to an ominous dark gray. Massive cumulonimbus clouds towered in the distance, their anvil-shaped tops spreading outward at high altitude. These weren't ordinary clouds. They were weather engines, massive vertical structures of unstable air that experienced pilots treated with healthy respect. In the cockpit, James was making another attempt at caution. "Captain, that cell at our 2 o'clock is building rapidly. The gap is narrowing." Ethan's jaw set stubbornly. "We have plenty of clearance. This isn't my first weather system, Rivera." "Apex 101 Gander Center." The radio interrupted. "Be advised, we now have reports of severe plus turbulence in your vicinity. All other traffic is deviating. What are your intentions?" Ethan took the radio himself this time. "Gander Apex 101. We're monitoring the weather closely and will deviate if necessary. Continuing on planned track for now." The controller's voice betrayed a hint of concern. "Apex 101, understand you're continuing. Be advised, Company 424 reported extreme turbulence just 20 miles north of your position, same altitude." "Roger that information," Ethan replied dismissively. James could remain silent no longer. "Captain, that's another Apex aircraft reporting extreme conditions. Company procedures explicitly state I'm well aware of what the procedures state." Ethan snapped. "I'm also aware that half these pilots overreact to every cloud they see. We're continuing as planned." The first officer fell silent, but his discomfort was palpable. He made another note in the electronic flight log documenting the decision, and the warnings received a small act of professional self-protection that spoke volumes about the cockpit dynamic. Victoria felt the first light bumps as the massive aircraft encountered the outer edges of the weather system. Most passengers barely noticed, continuing their movies or conversations. But having flown through countless weather systems herself, Victoria recognized the distinctive signature of these initial jolts, the harbingers of something more significant to come. She glanced around the cabin, noting how some more experienced travelers were already securing their belongings, preparing instinctively for rougher conditions. An elderly passenger across the aisle looked nervous, gripping her armrests tightly. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and Sophia's voice came over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the seatbelt sign as we're expecting turbulence. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are fastened securely. Flight attendants, prepare for turbulence." There was an urgency in her voice that went beyond the standard announcement, a professional warning that those with flying experience would recognize immediately. In the cockpit, the weather radar now showed they were approaching the narrow corridor Ethan had identified between two massive storm cells. The gap appeared to be closing more quickly than anticipated, the colors on the screen bleeding together as the separate cells began to merge. "That gap is disappearing," James warned, his voice tense. "We should turn back while we still have clear air behind us." Ethan's face hardened. "We're committed now. Turning would take us through worse conditions. Trust my experience, Rivera. I've navigated hundreds of systems worse than this." As if to punctuate his statement, the aircraft suddenly dropped several feet, then rocked sideways as it encountered the first significant turbulence. The autopilot compensated, but the motion was jarring enough that exclamations could be heard from the cabin. "Reducing speed to turbulence penetration airspeed," Ethan announced, pulling back the throttles. This was standard procedure. Slowing the aircraft reduced structural stress during turbulence, but it was a tacit admission that they were now committed to flying through significant weather rather than around it, a decision made not by changing conditions, but by Ethan's unwillingness to reconsider his original plan. Apex 101. "How's your ride?" came the concerned query from Gander Center. "Moderate turbulence, manageable," Ethan replied tersely, even as the aircraft shuddered through another violent patch that was clearly beyond moderate by any standard definition. In the cabin, Victoria braced herself as the turbulence intensified. The aircraft pitched and rolled occasionally, dropping suddenly before being caught by the automated flight systems. Loose items slid across tray tables and a few overhead bins popped open, despite being properly closed. She heard a cry of pain from several rows back. Someone had been caught standing or unbuckled. Sophia and another flight attendant rushed to assist, moving with practiced efficiency despite the difficult conditions. Victoria made another note in her journal, her hand steady despite the shaking aircraft. Captain elected to proceed through significant weather, despite ATC warnings and apparent first officer concerns. Prioritized schedule over comfort, safety, consequence, cabin disruption, possible passenger injury. As a board member evaluating leadership, this moment was revealing. As a former military pilot who had faced similar decisions, it was concerning. What troubled Victoria most wasn't just the choice to fly through the weather, it was how the decision had been made. Without discussion, without genuine consideration of input, without apparent concern for those affected by the choice. In that moment, as Apex 101 shuddered through turbulence that could have been avoided, Victoria began to understand the true nature of Ethan Blackwell's command. This wasn't just about a missed greeting or professional discourtesy. This was about a fundamental misunderstanding of what leadership meant and the ripple effects that spread from that misunderstanding through an entire aircraft of 284 souls. The turbulence intensified without warning. What had been uncomfortable jolts transformed into violent, sustained shaking that rattled the entire aircraft. Drinks, spilled items fell from overhead bins, despite being supposedly secured, and the constant pitching motion left many passengers white-knuckled and nauseated. Severe turbulence, James announced, stating the obvious as warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. "We're getting structural stress warnings." Ethan's only response was to reduce speed further and disengage the autopilot, taking manual control of the aircraft. His hands were steady on the controls, his focus absolute as he hand flew the massive Dreamliner through the violent air currents. Whatever his failings as a leader, his skills as a pilot were undeniable. He handled the bucking aircraft with confidence born of thousands of hours of experience. In the main cabin, the consequences of his decision were playing out in real time. A drink cart, not fully secured in the galley, had broken loose, slamming into a bulkhead with a crash that heightened passenger anxiety. Sophia and her team were now fully occupied with damage control rather than regular service. Victoria observed a flight attendant helping an elderly man who had been struck by a falling laptop. He was holding a bloody napkin to his forehead, the injury minor but frightening for nearby passengers. 3 rows ahead, a young woman was violently ill, unable to reach a sick bag in time. The cabin interphone rang in the cockpit. James answered as Ethan continued to wrestle with the controls. "Flight deck," James responded. Sophia's voice came through professional, but tense. "We have multiple passenger injuries in the main cabin. Nothing critical, but we have a head laceration, a possible wrist sprain, and widespread motion sickness. How much longer in this turbulence?" James glanced at Ethan, who was fully focused on flying. "Stand by," he replied, muting the call. "Captain, cabin crew reports injuries. They need an estimate on duration." Ethan's expression didn't change. "Tell them we'll be through it in 20 minutes. Weather radar shows at least 40 minutes at current speed," James countered, pointing to the display. 20 minutes until the worst is behind us," Ethan clarified impatiently. "Don't alarm them unnecessarily." James unmuted the call. "Approximately 20 minutes to improved conditions, Sophia. Worst should pass before then." "Understood," she replied, though her tone suggested skepticism. "Be advised we're documenting all injuries for the incident report." That final comment, a subtle reminder that this event would require formal documentation, earned a scowl from Ethan, though he said nothing. In seat 3A, Victoria maintained her composed exterior despite the violent motion. As the aircraft pitched downward, suddenly dropping several hundred feet in seconds before recovering oxygen masks deployed in several rows where the compartment latches had failed under the strain. Passengers gasped and screamed. A baby wailed continuously from economy. The atmosphere had transformed from routine discomfort to genuine fear. Through it all, no announcement came from the cockpit. No reassurance, no update, no acknowledgement of the situation. Victoria watched as Sophia moved through the cabin despite the dangerous conditions, checking on passengers, offering calm reassurance, and treating minor injuries. The contrast between the flight attendants' visible leadership and the cockpit's silence was striking. When the interphone rang again 10 minutes later, James answered once more. "Flight deck." This time, Sophia's voice was more insistent. "We need a medical diversion decision, Captain. We have an elderly passenger experiencing chest pains that began during the turbulence. She has a cardiac history." Ethan's jaw tightened visibly. "Ask if there's a doctor on board," he directed James without taking his hands from the controls. James relayed the question and waited for Sophia's response. "We have a nurse practitioner who's assisting, but she's recommending medical attention as soon as possible. The passenger's medication is in her checked baggage." Now, Ethan faced a true command decision, one that would reveal his priorities more clearly than any casual interaction. Diverting meant delay paperwork, potential career impact if deemed unnecessary, and significant cost to the airline. Continuing meant potential risk to a passenger's health. "What's the nearest suitable diversion airport?" he asked James. His tone clipped. James quickly checked the navigation system. "Keflavik, Iceland. We could be on the ground in approximately 50 minutes. Ethan considered this for only a moment. "Tell them we're continuing to London. We're already halfway across the Atlantic. London has better medical facilities, and a diversion extends this passenger's time without medical care unnecessarily." James hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with the decision. "Captain Company policy states that medical emergencies take priority over." "This isn't an emergency yet." Ethan cut him off sharply. "It's discomfort, potentially exacerbated by turbulence. Inform the cabin crew we're continuing to London and will request priority handling and medical services on arrival. Victoria couldn't hear this exchange, but she observed the growing concern among the cabin crew as Sophia returned from the cockpit call. The lead flight attendant's professional demeanor remained intact, but her terse whispers to her team and their surprised expressions told a story of their own. An announcement finally came, not from the captain, but from Sophia, ladies and gentlemen. We apologize for the continued turbulence. The flight deck assures us we should be in smoother air shortly. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts securely fastened. No mention of the medical situation, no update on their progress, no reassurance from the captain's voice, just a flight attendant doing her best to fill a leadership vacuum. Victoria made detailed notes in her journal recording not just what was happening, but how it was being handled. As a board member evaluating Ethan Blackwell, she was witnessing a case study in technical skill divorced from leadership responsibility. As a passenger experiencing the consequences of his decisions, she was seeing firsthand why customer satisfaction ratings had plummeted. The turbulence gradually began to ease after another 25 minutes. Not the 20 Ethan had predicted, but eventually tapering to occasional bumps, rather than continuous violent motion. The cabin slowly returned to something resembling normalcy, though the atmosphere remained tense. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking on passengers, distributing fresh drinks and cleaning up the considerable debris. In the cockpit, Ethan re-engaged the autopilot once the worst had passed, flexing his fingers after the extended period of hand flying. There was satisfaction in his expression. He had navigated a challenging situation, using his considerable skills exactly as he had planned. C. Rivera. We saved 40 minutes of flight time and several thousand pounds of fuel. The turbulence was manageable. James looked at him incredulously. We have injured passengers and a potential medical situation. How is that manageable? Aircraft encounters turbulence. It's an operational reality, not a crisis, Ethan replied dismissively. Half those injuries will be passengers looking for vouchers or upgrades. The callousness of the statement hung in the air between them. James said nothing more, but something had changed in his demeanor. A line had been crossed, a realization formed. His respect for Ethan's technical abilities remained intact, but his perception of Ethan as a captain had been fundamentally altered. As the flight continued toward Europe, Victoria observed the aftermath in the cabin. Sophia and her team had performed admirably under difficult circumstances, but the strain showed in their faces. The elderly passenger with chest pains was being monitored closely by the nurse practitioner passenger who had volunteered to stay with her for the remainder of the flight. Victoria made her final note on this phase of the journey. Captain prioritized operational efficiency over passenger welfare. Decision-making process excluded input from FO and cabin crew. Technical execution, excellent. Leadership execution, deeply flawed. Question: is this an isolated incident or pattern behavior? What she couldn't know yet was how Ethan would respond when directly confronted about these decisions. That moment was still to come, and it would reveal even more about the man behind the four stripes. As Apex 101 approached European airspace, the aftermath of the turbulence incident lingered throughout the aircraft. In the cabin, flight attendants continued tending to shaken passengers and documenting injuries for the incident report. The elderly woman with chest pains had stabilized somewhat, but remained under close watch by both the volunteer nurse practitioner and Sophia, who checked on her every 15 minutes. In the cockpit, a tense silence had settled between Ethan and James. The routine cross-checks and procedures continued with professional precision, but the easy communication that characterized effective flight crews was noticeably absent. Each interaction was minimal, clinical, confined strictly to operational necessities. James had been quietly documenting everything in the electronic flight log, the weather warnings they'd received, the decision to continue through the system rather than deviate, the subsequent turbulence, and the injuries reported from the cabin. This digital record, automatically uploaded to Apex's flight operations system, would become part of the official record of the flight. Ethan noticed James's detailed entries and frowned. "You're overlogging. Keep it concise and factual." "I am keeping it factual," James replied evenly, not looking up from his tablet. "I'm recording the sequence of events and decisions exactly as they occurred." The challenge in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Rivera. That almost sounds insubordinate." James finally looked up, meeting Ethan's gaze directly. Something had shifted in the first officer, a boundary crossed, a limit reached. "Documenting facts isn't insubordination, Captain. Neither is following proper procedures, which I've attempted to do throughout this flight." "Are you implying I haven't followed procedures?" Ethan's voice lowered dangerously. "I'm stating directly that we received multiple warnings about severe turbulence. We had a recommended deviation route. We had company policy guiding weather avoidance. We chose to ignore all three." James's voice remained steady, professional. "That's not my interpretation. Those are facts that will appear in the flight record." Ethan's face hardened. "You lack the experience to understand the calculations involved in these decisions. Weather radar interpretation isn't something you learn in a simulator. With respect, Captain, this isn't about technical skill. It's about judgment," James countered. "We have injured passengers and a medical situation that could have been avoided. Turbulence injuries are an accepted risk of air travel," Ethan dismissed. "As for the medical situation, that passenger would have experienced the same issue regardless of our route." "You don't know that," James replied. "And you didn't consult with anyone before making these decisions. Not me, not the cabin crew, not medical personnel." Ethan leaned slightly toward James. His voice lowered. "Let me make something very clear, First Officer. In this cockpit, there is one captain. I don't command by committee. I don't need consensus for decisions that are mine alone to make. If that bothers you, perhaps, long-haul flying isn't for you." The threat was thinly veiled, a suggestion that James's career advancement could be impacted by his unwillingness to simply acquiesce. It was the kind of subtle intimidation that had likely silenced other first officers before him. But James had reached his breaking point. "Captain, I respect your experience and your technical abilities. What I can't respect is treating other crew members and passengers as if they don't matter." Ethan's expression darkened. "You're out of line, Rivera." "No, sir. For the first time this flight, I'm exactly in line with procedure, with company values, and with my responsibilities as a first officer." James's voice remained calm but firm. "The FOM is clear that first officers have a duty to speak up when they believe safety or company policy is being compromised." Before Ethan could respond, the cockpit door chimed. Sophia appeared a moment later, her expression professionally neutral despite the obvious tension she was entering. "Captain, I need to provide an update on our passenger with cardiac concerns. Her condition has stabilized, but the nurse practitioner is still recommending immediate medical attention upon landing. I've completed the special handling request for London." Ethan barely glanced at her. "Fine. Anything else?" "Yes, sir. A passenger in business class has requested to speak with you after landing. She specifically asked for you by name." This finally caught Ethan's attention. "Who?" "Dr. Simmons in 3A, Sophia replied. "She said it's regarding flight operations." "Tell her I don't do passenger meet and greets," Ethan said dismissively. "If she has feedback about the flight, she can submit it through customer service like everyone else." Sophia hesitated, her eyes briefly meeting James's. "Sir, she was quite insistent. She mentioned something about a complete evaluation of today's flight decisions." Something about that phrasing caused James to look up sharply, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. Ethan, however, remained unmoved. "I don't care how insistent she is. I'm not meeting with passengers to defend operational decisions they aren't qualified to understand." "Very well," Captain Sophia replied, her tone carefully neutral. "I'll inform her. Will there be any announcement from the flight deck about our arrival? Passengers are still quite shaken from the turbulence." "Standard arrival announcement." Ethan replied, turning back to his instruments in clear dismissal. After Sophia left, James was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Captain, I think we should reconsider speaking with Dr. Simmons." "Why?" Ethan asked irritably. "Because she has a doctoral degree and thinks that qualifies her to question flight operations." "No," James said carefully. "Because if she's who I think she is, refusing to meet with her would be unwise." "And who exactly do you think she is?" James chose his words deliberately. "I believe Dr. Victoria Simmons recently joined the Apex Board of Directors. Her background is in aerospace engineering and Air Force flight operations." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Ethan's face, quickly replaced by dismissal. "If a board member were on this flight, we'd have been notified. This is just another entitled passenger who doesn't like turbulence." James said nothing more, but his expression spoke volumes. The confrontation had revealed something fundamental about Ethan Blackwell. His absolute confidence in his own judgment wasn't just professional self-assurance. It was a rigid worldview that rejected any input that might challenge his authority or perspective. As Apex 101 began its initial descent toward London, Heathrow, Victoria made her final notes of the flight. She had observed every aspect of the operation from Ethan's initial dismissal at the cockpit door through his weather decision and subsequent handling of the consequences. She had witnessed his interaction with the cabin crew, his apparent dismissal of passenger concerns, and now his refusal to meet with her after landing. The evaluation was complete, and the results weren't merely disappointing, they were alarming. What she had witnessed wasn't just poor customer service or personal rudeness. It was a fundamental failure of leadership that created ripple effects throughout the aircraft, potentially compromising both safety and the airline's core values. As the massive landing gear extended with a reassuring thunk, Victoria closed her notebook and prepared for arrival. Captain Ethan Blackwell had no idea that his career now hung in the balance, the victim not of some technical failure, but of his own character flaws that had been invisible to those who judged only his flying skills and not his humanity. The true reckoning was about to begin. Apex Flight 101 descended through the cloud layer over London raindrops, streaking across the windows as the massive aircraft cut through the gray English morning. The approach was perfectly executed, smooth, precise, exactly on the glide slope, a technical demonstration of Ethan Blackwell's undeniable skill as a pilot. In the cockpit, Ethan handled the controls with practiced confidence. Whatever tensions had developed with his first officer, whatever concerns might have been raised about his decision-making, his actual flying remained exemplary. The Boeing 787 responded to his commands like an extension of his own body, the complex systems working in harmony under his guidance. "Flaps 30, he ordered calmly. "Flaps 30, James confirmed, moving the lever to its final landing position. The routine callouts continued: altitude checks, speed confirmations, landing clearance acknowledgement. The professional rhythm of a well-trained crew preparing an aircraft for landing. To an outside observer, nothing would appear amiss in the cockpit dynamics. Only the subtle tension in James's posture and the tight set of Ethan's jaw revealed the conflict beneath the surface. 1000 announced the automated voice of the aircraft system. Stabilized, continuing Ethan responded automatically. The last minutes of the approach proceeded in focused silence. Outside, the sprawling expanse of London emerged from the low clouds, the Thames snaking through the cityscape, the distinctive landmarks visible even from their altitude. In the passenger cabin, the atmosphere was subdued. The turbulence episode had left its mark not just in the minor injuries and disruptions, but in the collective mood of those on board. Where long-haul flights typically ended with passengers gathering belongings in anticipation, this one found many still seated seatbelts fastened tight, as if expecting another bout of violent motion at any moment. Victoria observed it all, noting how Sophia and her team moved through the cabin with reassuring smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. The elderly passenger who had experienced chest pains was now accompanied by an oxygen bottle, a precautionary measure for the descent. A flight attendant knelt beside her, monitoring her condition while maintaining a calm demeanor. The massive Dreamliner crossed the threshold of runway 27L, flaring perfectly as Ethan brought the nose up slightly. The main landing gear kissed the wet tarmac with barely a bump, the textbook greaser landing that pilots prided themselves on. Thrust reversers deployed with a roar, rain spray kicking up behind the aircraft as it decelerated along the runway. "Nice landing," Captain James acknowledged professionally despite everything that had transpired. Ethan merely nodded, already focusing on the taxi clearance from the tower. The acknowledgement of his technical skill was expected, not noteworthy. In his mind, anything less than perfection in aircraft handling was simply unacceptable. As they turned off the active runway and began the long taxi toward Terminal 5, Sophia's voice came over the interphone. "Flight deck, we have medical personnel standing by for our passenger in 14C. Also, we've had several passengers request incident reports for the turbulence. How would you like us to proceed?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Standard procedure. Anyone claiming injury can speak to the customer service desk. No need to hand out forms on the aircraft." James glanced at him but said nothing. Both knew that documented injuries would trigger a formal incident investigation, something Ethan clearly wanted to avoid. Captain Sophia replied carefully. "Company policy was updated last quarter. We're required to provide preliminary incident forms on board for any flight experiencing severe turbulence with reported injuries." "Fine," Ethan snapped. "Do what you need to do." He switched to the public address system without further discussion. "Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Blackwell here. We've arrived at London Heathrow. Current local time is 7:42 a.m. Weather is rainy with a temperature of 13 degrees Celsius. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach our gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of myself, First Officer Rivera, and the entire crew, thank you for flying Apex Airlines." The announcement was technically complete, but noticeably devoid of any acknowledgement of the difficult flight conditions, the injuries, or any expression of concern for passenger welfare. Just the bare minimum required by procedure. In Seat 3A, Victoria made her final notation in her journal. The technical landing had been impeccable, perhaps the smoothest she'd experienced in recent memory. Yet this only underscored her overall assessment. Captain Ethan Blackwell was the embodiment of technical excellence, without emotional intelligence of authority, without true leadership. As the aircraft approached its gate, passengers began gathering belongings despite the illuminated seatbelt sign. The normal impatience of arrival had reasserted itself, the shared trauma of the turbulence already beginning to fade for most. The jetway connected with a gentle bump, and moments later the main cabin door swung open. Medical personnel immediately boarded to attend to the elderly passenger moving with practiced efficiency. Victoria remained seated watching as Sophia directed the deplaning process with professional calm. Despite everything that had happened, the lead flight attendant maintained her composure, wishing each passenger a good day as they exited. When Ethan and James finally emerged from the cockpit, Victoria observed their body language carefully. Ethan led the way, his posture straight, his expression neutral as he nodded to the remaining passengers without making eye contact. James followed, taking a moment to thank Sophia and the cabin crew, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the difference between the two pilots. As Ethan passed row 3, Victoria made direct eye contact with him. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, not of who she was, but of her presence at the cockpit door hours earlier. He broke the gaze almost immediately, continuing toward the exit without acknowledgement. Victoria waited until most passengers had deplaned before gathering her things. As she prepared to leave, Sophia approached her. "Dr. Simmons, I apologize, but Captain Blackwell indicated he would not be available to meet after arrival. If you'd like to speak with a company representative, I can arrange." "That won't be necessary," Sophia. Victoria replied with a warm smile. Captain Blackwell and I will be speaking very soon, though not in the way he anticipates. You and your team did exceptional work today under difficult circumstances. Something in Victoria's tone caused Sophia to study her more carefully. Thank you, ma'am. Will you be needing anything else before you deplane? Just one thing, Victoria said, reaching into her briefcase to retrieve a business card. I'd appreciate if you could contact me directly to discuss today's flight in more detail. My office will arrange a convenient time. Sophia glanced at the card, her eyes widening slightly as she read the Apex Airlines Board of Directors designation beneath Victoria's name. Of course, Dr. Simmons. I'll make myself available whenever you require. Victoria nodded and moved toward the exit, pausing briefly at the door. One more thing, Sophia. I'd appreciate if you'd keep our conversation confidential for now. This evaluation isn't quite complete. As Victoria walked up the jetway toward the terminal, she pulled out her phone and dialed a direct number. Alexander Victoria Simmons, the Phoenix Initiative assessment is complete. She paused, listening to the response. No, I don't need more flights. I've seen everything necessary to make a determination. Another pause. Yes, that's serious. We need to convene the board as soon as possible. And Alexander? Make sure Captain Blackwell is summoned to headquarters immediately upon his return to New York. She ended the call and continued into the terminal where a discreet company representative was already waiting to escort her past the usual arrival procedures. Behind her, Apex Flight 101 was already being prepared for its return journey. The passengers from London to New York, unaware of the storm gathering in the corporate offices that would forever change the airline's culture and one pilot's career. The Phoenix Initiative had collected its first data point, and the results were damning. The arrival processes at Heathrow's Terminal 5 proceeded with typical British efficiency. Passengers from Apex 101 streamed through the jetway, dispersing toward customs baggage claim or connecting flights. The turbulence incident had already begun transforming in their collective memory, the horror softening into an anecdote, a travel story to share with friends and family. Ethan and James completed their post-flight duties with minimal interaction, the tension between them now a palpable barrier. The walk-around inspection, the logbook entries, the handover to the maintenance crew all conducted with professional thoroughness, but without the camaraderie that typically characterized crew relationships. As they entered the terminal, Ethan checked his watch. Crew transport to the hotel leaves in 40 minutes. Flight planning for tomorrow's return is at 1700 in the crew room. James nodded. I'll be there. They continued in silence through the crew passage toward immigration, each lost in his own thoughts. The exhaustion of the long flight, combined with the emotional strain of their confrontation, left little energy for further discussion. At the crew immigration desk, they were met by Graham Phillips, Apex's London station manager. Tall and rail-thin, with a perpetually worried expression, Graham had spent 30 years managing airline operations at Heathrow. Very little surprised him anymore. Captain Blackwell. First Officer Rivera. He greeted them with a crisp nod. How was the crossing? Standard Atlantic run, Ethan replied dismissively. Minor turbulence. Nothing unusual. James's eyebrows rose slightly at this characterization, but he remained silent. Graham consulted his tablet. I see we had medical personnel meet the aircraft. Anything I should be aware of? Elderly passenger with chest discomfort, Ethan said. Likely anxiety from the weather. Nothing operational. Graham made a note. Very good. Also, Captain, I've been asked to inform you that a company representative will be meeting your return flight tomorrow in New York. This was unusual enough to break through Ethan's practiced indifference. For what purpose, I wasn't given specifics, sir. Just asked to relay the information. Ethan frowned. Probably another efficiency consultant with a clipboard. The company wastes more time on these corporate exercises. He trailed off as he noticed a familiar figure approaching through the terminal, Dr. Victoria Simmons, accompanied by a uniformed Apex customer service representative. She was walking directly toward them with purpose in her stride. "Excuse me," Victoria said as she approached, her voice polite but firm. "Captain Blackwell, I'm Dr. Victoria Simmons. I was in seat 3A on your flight from New York. I had requested a brief discussion after landing." Ethan's expression hardened. "As I'm sure the cabin crew informed you, Dr. Simmons, I don't conduct passenger meetings. If you have feedback about your flight experience, customer service will be happy to assist you." He gestured to the representative accompanying her. Victoria's calm expression didn't waver. "I understand you're busy, Captain. However, I believe you'd find our conversation worthwhile. It concerns your handling of today's flight, particularly the decision to proceed through severe weather despite multiple warnings." James tensed visibly, his earlier suspicion about Victoria's identity clearly surfacing again. Graham Phillips looked confused, glancing between the captain and this unexpectedly assertive passenger. Ethan's response was cold and clipped. "Ma'am, with all due respect, weather routing decisions are made based on technical factors that most passengers aren't qualified to evaluate. I've been flying the North Atlantic for 22 years. The turbulence we experienced was well within the aircraft's capabilities." "I'm not questioning the aircraft's capabilities," Captain Victoria replied evenly. "I'm questioning your judgment in unnecessarily exposing passengers and crew to conditions that resulted in injuries and a medical situation." Now Ethan's professional demeanor cracked slightly, irritation bleeding through. "Dr. Simmons, unless you have an airline transport pilot license and type rating on the 787, your opinion on my operational decisions is irrelevant. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have post-flight duties to attend to." He attempted to step past her, a clear dismissal. Victoria didn't move. "Actually, Captain Blackwell, I do hold an ATP license, though not a current 787 type rating. I flew C-17s for the Air Force for 15 years before transitioning to aviation safety oversight." But more relevantly to this conversation, she reached into her blazer and produced a business card, offering it to him. "I'm the newest member of Apex Airlines Board of Directors, and I was on your flight specifically to evaluate cockpit leadership and decision-making as part of the Phoenix Initiative." The color drained from Ethan's face as he stared at the card. James looked simultaneously vindicated and concerned. Graham Phillips took an involuntary step backward, suddenly very interested in his tablet. "I wasn't informed of any board evaluation." Ethan managed his voice, losing its confident edge. "That was by design," Victoria explained calmly. "The Phoenix Initiative involves unannounced observations of our most senior captains in their natural operating environment. We're evaluating not just technical proficiency, but leadership quality, crew resource management, and alignment with company values." Ethan's training reasserted itself quickly. "Of course, Dr. Simmons. I'd be happy to discuss the flight in detail. Perhaps we could arrange a proper briefing." "That won't be necessary." Captain Victoria cut him off politely but firmly. "I've observed everything I needed to evaluate. The board will be meeting to review my findings upon my return to New York. You can expect formal communication through official channels." The professional mask slipped completely from Ethan's face, replaced by something between indignation and alarm. "Dr. Simmons, if this is about the turbulence, I stand by my decision. The route deviation would have added significant flight time and fuel burn for what was ultimately a manageable weather situation." Captain Blackwell Victoria replied, her tone unchanged. "This evaluation began the moment I approached your cockpit door before departure, and you refused to even acknowledge my existence. It continued through your dismissal of First Officer Rivera's procedural recommendations, your decision to ignore ATC weather advisories, and your handling of the resulting passenger injuries. The pattern is clear and consistent." She glanced at her watch. "I won't keep you from your crew rest. I understand the importance of proper rest periods before return flights. Good day, Captain Blackwell. First Officer Rivera." She nodded to each of them in turn, then walked away, the customer service representative trailing behind her. The three men stood in stunned silence for a moment. Graham Phillips cleared his throat awkwardly. "Right, well, I'll make sure the crew transport is ready for you, gentlemen." He hurried away, clearly eager to escape the uncomfortable aftermath. James finally broke the silence. "I tried to tell you who she might be." Ethan's expression had transformed from shock to something harder, more defensive. "This is ridiculous. One board member playing undercover boss doesn't change the fact that I made the correct operational decisions." "Did you?" James asked quietly. "Because from where I was sitting, we had multiple opportunities to avoid what happened. You lack the experience to make that assessment, Rivera." "That's just it, Captain. This isn't about experience or technical skill. It's about basic human respect and sound judgment." James sighed, fatigue evident in his voice. "I'm going to get some rest before tomorrow's flight. I suggest you do the same." As James walked away, Ethan remained rooted in place, the business card still clutched in his hand. For perhaps the first time in his career, he faced a professional challenge that couldn't be overcome with technical skill or by asserting his authority. A board member had witnessed his leadership style firsthand and found it wanting. The implications were just beginning to register. The A380 fleet captain position he'd been confidently expecting, the crowning achievement of his career that would put him in charge of Apex's newest flagship aircraft, suddenly seemed far less certain. Ethan finally moved toward the exit, his usual commanding stride noticeably diminished. The weight of uncertainty and unfamiliar burden for a man accustomed to absolute confidence had settled firmly on his shoulders. The cockpit kingdom he had ruled so absolutely was showing its first serious cracks. 3 days after Apex Flight 101 touched down at Heathrow, Ethan Blackwell stood in his Manhattan apartment, staring at his phone in disbelief. The return flight had been uneventful. No weather challenges, no difficult passengers, not even a minor mechanical issue to manage. James had been professionally cordial but distant throughout, and Ethan had maintained his usual command presence despite the unresolved tension from Victoria Simmons' revelation. Upon landing at JFK, Ethan had half expected some immediate fallout from the Phoenix Initiative evaluation, but there had been nothing. No waiting executives, no urgent messages, no indication that anything was amiss. He had begun to wonder if perhaps the incident would simply fade away, lost in the corporate bureaucracy that governed large airlines. That illusion had just been shattered by the call he'd received from Melissa Diaz, Apex's head of human resources. "Captain Blackwell," she had said, her tone professionally neutral. "Your presence is required at corporate headquarters tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Chairman Harrington and the executive board have requested a meeting in the main boardroom. This is mandatory and takes priority over any scheduled duties." When Ethan asked about the purpose of the meeting, her response had been tellingly vague. "The agenda concerns operational matters that require your personal attention. Please be punctual. Professional dress is expected." Now, as he hung up the phone, the full weight of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't a routine operational review or standard debriefing. The main boardroom, Chairman Harrington, the executive board. This had all the hallmarks of a serious corporate intervention, and the timing just days after Dr. Simmons' evaluation couldn't be coincidental. Ethan moved to his closet and began methodically selecting his attire for the meeting. His finest suit, freshly pressed shirt, conservative tie. His movements were precise, controlled, masking the growing unease he refused to acknowledge even to himself. Throughout his career, he had faced challenges with absolute confidence in his abilities and judgment. This situation would be no different. Across town, in a modest Queens apartment, James Rivera also received a call from Melissa Diaz. His summons was identical 9 a.m. main boardroom mandatory attendance. Unlike Ethan, James had been expecting something of this nature since the moment Victoria Simmons had revealed her identity in London. After ending the call, James sat quietly on his couch, processing the implications. As first officer, his role in the upcoming proceedings was unclear. Would he be asked to testify against his captain? Would his own actions during Flight 101 be scrutinized? Had his pushback against Ethan's decisions been sufficient, or would the board view his initial compliance as problematic? James picked up his tablet and opened his detailed notes from the flight, the contemporaneous record he had maintained throughout the turbulence incident. Everything was there: the weather warnings, Ethan's dismissals of procedure, the resulting passenger injuries. It wasn't a document he had created to incriminate his captain. It was simply the professional record he maintained as a matter of practice. Now, however, it might become evidence in whatever proceedings tomorrow would bring. Meanwhile, in the executive suite of Apex headquarters, Alexander Harrington reviewed Victoria Simmons's comprehensive evaluation report with growing concern. The Phoenix Initiative had been his brainchild, a response to troubling patterns in customer feedback and safety reports that suggested a cultural issue within the cockpit ranks. But even he hadn't anticipated findings this alarming from their very first evaluation. "The report is conclusive," Victoria explained as they sat in Harrington's office. "Captain Blackwell demonstrates technical excellence but fundamental leadership deficiencies. His behavior creates unnecessary risks, undermines crew coordination, and directly contradicts our stated company values." Harrington sighed heavily. "The timing is problematic. The A380 program is our largest investment in a decade. Blackwell was our leading candidate for fleet captain." "That's precisely why this matters so much," Victoria countered. "The A380 program isn't just about new aircraft, it's about redefining Apex for the next generation. Do we want Ethan Blackwell's leadership style setting the standard for our most visible routes and training our next generation of pilots?" The chairman nodded slowly. "You're right, of course. We've been promoting technical skill over leadership quality for too long. It's created exactly the culture problems we're now trying to correct." He stood and moved to the window, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. "Have you spoken with Captain Sullivan?" "Yes," Victoria confirmed. "As chief pilot, Michael will participate in tomorrow's meeting. He's reviewed the findings and supports the board's authority in this matter, though he expressed personal disappointment. He and Blackwell have history. And James Rivera, the first officer. His conduct during the flight was professional under difficult circumstances. He attempted to follow procedures and raised appropriate concerns. His testimony will be valuable." Harrington turned back from the window. "This won't be easy. Blackwell has supporters in the pilot ranks, particularly among the old guard. There will be pushback. Necessary change rarely comes without resistance," Victoria observed. "But if we're serious about transforming our culture, this is where it begins with clear accountability at the highest levels." The chairman nodded decisively. "Prepare the board for a full hearing tomorrow. All evidence, all witnesses. Captain Blackwell deserves a complete accounting of the issues before any decisions are made." As night fell over New York City, the key players in tomorrow's drama prepared in their own ways. Ethan Blackwell reviewed his logbooks and flight records, building his technical defense with methodical precision. James Rivera made peace with his role in the process, knowing that professional integrity sometimes required difficult choices. Victoria Simmons finalized her evaluation report, ensuring every observation was backed by specific examples and data. And Alexander Harrington contemplated the future of Apex Airlines, a future that would be shaped one way or another by the decisions made in tomorrow's boardroom. None of them slept particularly well that night. The reckoning was coming, and it would test not just one pilot's career, but an entire airline's values and commitment to change. The main boardroom of Apex Airlines occupied the entire northeast corner of the 47th floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of Manhattan and the East River beyond. The massive oval table of polished walnut dominated the space, surrounded by 16 high-backed leather chairs. The room was designed to impress, to intimidate, to convey the weight and authority of corporate power. At precisely 8:55 a.m., Ethan Blackwell arrived immaculately dressed in a charcoal gray suit, white shirt, and burgundy tie. His uniform might have been more appropriate for a flight operations review, but something had told him this meeting required the gravitas of formal business attire. He nodded to the executive assistant stationed outside the boardroom. Captain Blackwell for the 9 a.m. meeting. Yes, Captain, she replied. They're expecting you. Please wait a moment while I notify Chairman Harrington. Ethan stood perfectly straight, projecting confidence despite the uncertainty churning beneath his professional veneer. After a brief call, the assistant gestured toward the boardroom door. You may enter now, Captain. The scene that greeted Ethan stopped him momentarily in his tracks. The entire executive board was already seated, 10 senior figures from Apex's leadership team arranged along both sides of the table. At the head sat Alexander Harrington, the company's silver-haired chairman and former Air Force general. To his right was Victoria Simmons, now dressed in a formal business suit rather than the casual attire she'd worn on Flight 101. More surprising was the presence of James Rivera, already seated near the foot of the table, a tablet and portfolio of documents before him. Captain Michael Sullivan, Apex's chief pilot and the man responsible for all flight operations, sat opposite James, his expression grave. And most unexpectedly, Sophia Mendez was there as well, her flight attendant's uniform exchanged for business attire. Captain Blackwell. Alexander Harrington's voice cut through the silence. Thank you for joining us. Please take the seat at the end of the table. The only empty chair was at the foot of the table, the position furthest from the chairman and symbolically the least powerful in the room. The seating arrangement wasn't accidental and its message wasn't subtle. Ethan moved to the designated chair, his face carefully composed, despite the growing realization that this was far more serious than he had anticipated. As he sat, he noticed recording equipment discreetly positioned on the table and a legal pad at each person's place. This wasn't merely a review, it was a formal hearing. Captain Blackwell Harrington began his military background, evident in his direct approach. This meeting has been convened to address serious concerns regarding your conduct and decision-making during Apex Flight 101 3 days ago. Before we proceed, I want to be clear about the nature of these proceedings. He gestured to a woman Ethan didn't recognize, seated to his left. This is Andrea Lawson, General Counsel for Apex Airlines. She's here to ensure that all legal and procedural protocols are followed correctly. This meeting is being recorded and a transcript will become part of your personnel file. Do you understand? Ethan's mouth went dry, but he nodded. Yes, Chairman. I understand. Good. I'll now turn the floor over to Dr. Victoria Simmons, who will present her findings from the Phoenix Initiative evaluation conducted during your recent flight. Victoria opened a leather portfolio and adjusted her glasses. Thank you, Chairman Harrington. For context, the Phoenix Initiative was established by this board to evaluate leadership quality among our senior pilots through direct observation in operational settings. As the newest board member with relevant aviation experience, I was assigned to conduct the first such evaluation on Flight 101. She looked directly at Ethan. Captain Blackwell, my evaluation began the moment I approached your cockpit before departure and continued through every phase of the flight. I was specifically assessing leadership behaviors, decision-making processes, crew resource management, and alignment with Apex's stated values. Victoria referenced her notes. My findings identify 4 areas of critical concern. First, your refusal to acknowledge or greet a passenger at the cockpit door, demonstrating disrespect and poor customer service. Second, your dismissal of First Officer Rivera's procedural recommendations regarding the LGEN temperature alert. Third, your decision to proceed through severe weather despite multiple warnings from ATC and objections from your first officer. And finally, your handling of the resulting passenger injuries and medical situation. She slid a document across the table. This is my complete report, which includes timestamps, specific quotes, and observed behaviors. The pattern is clear and consistent technical proficiency coupled with leadership deficiencies that created unnecessary risk and negatively impacted both crew performance and passenger experience. Ethan glanced at the document but didn't reach for it. 22 years of spotless evaluations, and now his career was being dismantled over what he considered routine operational decisions. With respect, Dr. Simmons, he said, his voice tight but controlled, a single flight observed by someone without current 787 experience hardly constitutes a fair evaluation of my command abilities. Victoria's expression remained neutral. Captain Blackwell, I'm not evaluating your ability to fly the aircraft. I'm evaluating your leadership. And leadership isn't aircraft specific, it's universal. Moreover, this wasn't simply my subjective assessment. We have additional testimony and evidence. Harrington nodded to James Rivera. First Officer Rivera, please share your observations of the flight. James straightened in his chair, clearly uncomfortable but determined. During Flight 101, I observed multiple instances where Captain Blackwell dismissed standard procedures and input from both myself and the cabin crew. When the LGEN temperature alert activated, he overruled my recommendation to run the appropriate checklist. When ATC advised weather deviation, he dismissed multiple warnings despite clear evidence of severe conditions ahead. After encountering turbulence that resulted in passenger injuries, he refused to consider diversion for a medical situation. James referenced his tablet. I've provided my contemporaneous notes from the flight which document each incident with timestamps and specific details. I also wish to state that while Captain Blackwell's aircraft handling was excellent throughout, his leadership approach created an environment where raising safety concerns became increasingly difficult. Ethan stared at James, feeling the sting of betrayal, despite knowing that everything the first officer had said was factually accurate. It was the interpretation he objected to, the suggestion that his confident decision-making was somehow a leadership failure, rather than the mark of an experienced captain. Michael Sullivan, the chief pilot, spoke next. Captain Blackwell, I've reviewed the flight data, the weather information available to you at the time, and the communications logs. The data shows that a viable deviation route was available that would have avoided the worst turbulence with minimal impact on fuel and schedule. Can you explain your reasoning for not taking that option? Ethan straightened on familiar ground when discussing operational decisions. The weather radar showed sufficient spacing between cells to maintain our planned route. The suggested deviation would have added flight time and burned additional fuel for what I assessed as manageable conditions. The 787 is rated for severe turbulence, and my decision was within my authority as captain. No one is questioning your authority as captain, Sullivan replied. We're questioning your judgment in using that authority. The resulting injuries suggest your assessment was flawed. Turbulence injuries can occur in light chop, Captain Sullivan, Ethan countered. They're often a result of passengers ignoring the seatbelt sign, not the severity of the conditions. Sophia Mendez cleared her throat. When Harrington nodded to her, she spoke with clear professionalism. With respect, Captain Blackwell, that's not accurate in this case. My cabin crew had fully secured the cabin following your turbulence warning. The injuries occurred because the actual conditions far exceeded what you described to us. We were prepared for light to moderate turbulence, as you stated. What we experienced was severe to extreme. She referenced her own notes. We had 5 documented injuries, including a head laceration requiring stitches, a sprained wrist, and an elderly passenger experiencing cardiac symptoms. Additionally, a service cart broke free from its locks due to the intensity of the motion, something that occurs only in severe turbulence. The evidence was mounting piece by piece, building a case that Ethan couldn't easily dismiss. But it was Alexander Harrington's next statement that truly revealed the gravity of the situation. Captain Blackwell, this isn't merely about one flight or one weather decision. Dr. Simmons' evaluation has brought to light a pattern of behavior that appears consistent with previous incidents in your file. He gestured to Andrea Lawson, who opened a thick folder. We have documentation of 7 formal complaints against you in the past 18 months. 3 from cabin crew regarding dismissive treatment, 2 from passengers who felt disrespected, and 2 from junior pilots reporting intimidation when they raised procedural concerns. Ethan's face paled slightly. He had known about some of these incidents, but most had been resolved with minimal documentation. He hadn't realized they formed part of a pattern being monitored at the highest levels. Each incident viewed in isolation might be dismissed as a misunderstanding or personality clash. Harrington continued. But viewed collectively and now confirmed by direct board observation, they reveal a leadership approach fundamentally at odds with Apex Airlines' values and expectations. The chairman leaned forward, his expression grave. Captain Blackwell, we've presented the preliminary findings. You now have the opportunity to respond before we discuss potential consequences. I encourage you to address not just the specific incidents of Flight 101, but the broader leadership concerns they represent. All eyes turned to Ethan. The technical defenses he had prepared suddenly seemed inadequate against this comprehensive assessment of his character and leadership. For perhaps the first time in his professional life, Ethan Blackwell found himself without a clear flight path forward. The reckoning had begun in earnest, and it would not be confined to a single turbulence incident or passenger greeting. This was about who he was as a pilot, as a leader, and as a representative of Apex Airlines, and his response in the next few minutes might well determine the future of his career. Ethan Blackwell felt the weight of every gaze in the boardroom as he composed his response. For a man accustomed to absolute control in his domain, this scrutiny was profoundly uncomfortable, yet he maintained his outward composure through years of professional discipline. Chairman Harrington, board members, he began, his voice steady, I acknowledge the concerns raised regarding Flight 101. However, I believe this evaluation lacks critical context about the realities of international flight operations and the responsibilities of command. He straightened his shoulders slightly. The cockpit greeting incident has been overemphasized. Pre-departure is a critical phase with numerous technical tasks that require full attention. As for the weather decision, I made a calculated risk assessment based on decades of Atlantic crossing experience and the aircraft's capabilities. The turbulence, while uncomfortable, was well within safety parameters. Ethan gestured toward James. First Officer Rivera is relatively inexperienced on this route. His concerns, while noted, reflect a by-the-book approach that doesn't always align with real-world operational efficiency. James's expression tightened, but he remained silent, letting Ethan continue. Regarding the passenger injuries, Ethan went on. I regret any discomfort experienced, but turbulence is an inherent risk of air travel that all passengers accept. As for the medical situation, diversion to Keflavik would have extended the elderly passenger's time without advanced medical care, not reduced it. London offered superior facilities available sooner, given our position when the symptoms were reported. He concluded with confidence. My 22-year record speaks for itself. Thousands of flights, 0 incidents, consistent on-time performance, and optimal fuel efficiency. One challenging flight observed by a non-current pilot shouldn't overshadow that record of excellence. The room remained silent for a moment after he finished. Then Victoria Simmons spoke, her tone measured but firm. Captain Blackwell, you've framed this entirely as a technical evaluation, but that misses the fundamental point. The Phoenix Initiative isn't about your flying skills, it's about leadership and values. Let me be more specific. She opened a laptop and turned it to face the room. With permission from our legal team, we're going to play selected portions of the cockpit voice recorder from Flight 101. These excerpts have been preserved as part of our investigation. Ethan's confidence faltered visibly. CVR recordings were typically only reviewed after accidents or serious incidents. Using them for a leadership evaluation was unprecedented. Before he could object, Andrea Lawson intervened. For the record, this usage complies with all regulations and company policies for internal review purposes. The recordings will not be released beyond this room. Victoria pressed play. The familiar sounds of the cockpit filled the boardroom, the background hum of systems, the clicks of switches, and then the voices. Good morning, gentlemen. Looks like a beautiful day to fly. Victoria's voice was clear and pleasant. James's response followed. Good morning, ma'am. It certainly is. Should be a smooth flight once we get past some weather over the Atlantic. Then silence followed by Ethan's curt command. First Officer Rivera, secure the door. We're completing critical pre-flight checks. Victoria paused the recording. This first interaction establishes the baseline. A simple greeting met with deliberate dismissal. No acknowledgement, no courtesy, not even eye contact, according to my notes and First Officer Rivera's testimony. She advanced to another section. Captain, we've got an LGN temperature alert. James's voice was professional. Within limits, but trending up. Let's reduce power on the left engine by 3% and monitor. Should I run the non-normal checklist for generator drive temperature? That's not necessary. It's a minor fluctuation, not a full exceedance. Keep monitoring it. The manual recommends running the checklist even for caution indicators. It's standard procedure to... I'm familiar with the procedures, First Officer. I wrote some of them. This aircraft has known sensor issues in the LGEN that often present as false positives. Running unnecessary checklists creates more problems than it solves. Victoria paused again. This exchange demonstrates dismissal of standard procedures and undermining of First Officer Rivera's appropriate procedural recommendation. The pattern continued through several more recordings, each more damning than the last. The weather decision, with multiple ATC warnings clearly audible. The terse interactions with the cabin crew. The dismissal of diversion considerations when the medical situation was reported. Most revealing was a quiet exchange after particularly intense turbulence. See Rivera. We saved 40 minutes of flight time and several thousand pounds of fuel. The turbulence was manageable. We have injured passengers and a potential medical situation. How is that manageable aircraft encounters turbulence? It's an operational reality, not a crisis. Half those injuries will be passengers looking for vouchers or upgrades. The callousness in Ethan's recorded voice hung in the air as Victoria closed the laptop. Several board members exchanged troubled glances. Michael Sullivan, the chief pilot, spoke next, his expression grave. Captain Blackwell. I've also reviewed the flight data recorder information, which confirms the severity of the turbulence encountered. We recorded vertical accelerations exceeding 0.8 g, well into the severe category by any standard definition. This wasn't moderate chop, as you characterized it to your crew. He slid a printout across the table. This graph shows the actual turbulence intensity compared to the forecasts and warnings you received. The data contradicts your assertion that this was a reasonable risk. Sullivan continued, his disappointment evident. As someone who has known you for 15 years, I find your characterization of passenger injuries particularly troubling. These weren't people looking for vouchers. They were our customers who trusted us with their safety and were hurt because of a decision to prioritize schedule over caution. Ethan stared at the evidence before him, his carefully constructed defense crumbling. The objective data couldn't be dismissed as subjective evaluation or inexperienced observation. His own words preserved in the CVR revealed attitudes he typically kept carefully concealed from superiors. Alexander Harrington gestured to Sophia Mendez. Ms. Mendez, as the lead flight attendant responsible for cabin safety, please share your observations about the impact of these decisions on passenger welfare. Sophia's testimony was measured but devastating. She described elderly passengers crying in fear, the blood from a head injury staining the cabin carpet, the young mother comforting a terrified child. She detailed how the cabin crew had struggled to maintain order and provide care while being tossed about the aircraft themselves. What troubled me most, she concluded, was the lack of communication from the flight deck. We received minimal information about what to expect or how long the conditions would last. When we requested updates, we were told not to bother the pilots with cabin issues. This created a disconnect that made our job of reassuring passengers nearly impossible. As each piece of evidence was presented, Ethan's expression grew increasingly strained. The narrative being constructed wasn't just about one bad flight or one poor decision. It was about a fundamental failure of leadership philosophy, a pattern of behavior that prioritized technical performance over human welfare efficiency over respect. James Rivera spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. I want to clarify something important. My concerns during the flight weren't based on inexperience or overly cautious, by-the-book flying as Captain Blackwell suggested. They were based on standard industry practices that exist for good reason. He looked directly at Ethan for the first time. Captain Blackwell is an exceptional pilot in terms of aircraft handling and systems knowledge. I've learned a tremendous amount flying with him. But the culture he creates in the cockpit is one where questioning or suggesting alternatives is seen as weakness or insubordination. That's not just uncomfortable, it's unsafe. Victoria nodded agreement. This gets to the heart of the Phoenix Initiative. Technical excellence without leadership quality creates exactly the type of culture we're trying to change at Apex. The data shows that accidents and incidents rarely result from lack of flying skill. They come from communication failures, authority gradients that are too steep, and decision-making that doesn't incorporate all available information. She turned to Ethan. Captain Blackwell, your response to these concerns has been telling. You've addressed only the technical aspects, defending your decisions based on aircraft capabilities and operational efficiency. Not once have you acknowledged the human impact of those decisions or the legitimate concerns raised by your crew. Alexander Harrington leaned forward, his expression solemn. Before we proceed to discuss consequences, Captain Blackwell, I want to give you one final opportunity to address the core issue here. Do you recognize any legitimacy in the leadership concerns we've raised? Do you see any need for change in your approach to command? The question hung in the air, offering Ethan a last chance at redemption, or at least mitigation. His response would reveal whether he truly understood the nature of the proceedings or remained entrenched in his technical justifications. The reckoning had reached its critical moment. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies consistent, the data irrefutable. What remained to be seen was whether Ethan Blackwell could acknowledge what everyone else in the room already saw clearly, that his approach to leadership had become a liability to himself, his crew, his passengers, and ultimately to Apex Airlines itself. The weight of expectation pressed down on Ethan as Alexander Harrington's question hung in the air. The boardroom had gone utterly silent. No papers shuffling, no chairs creaking. Nothing but the faint hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic 47 floors below. This was Ethan's moment of truth, his final opportunity to demonstrate insight and growth potential. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but a genuine acknowledgement of fault, a sincere commitment to change, these might still salvage something from the wreckage of his reputation. Ethan cleared his throat, conscious of every eye upon him. Chairman Harrington, board members, I've listened carefully to the concerns raised here today. I acknowledge that my approach may appear strict to those with different leadership philosophies. He paused, choosing his words carefully. If my professionalism has been perceived as dismissiveness, that was not my intention. My focus has always been operational excellence and safety through adherence to the highest technical standards. Victoria Simmons' expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes suggested disappointment as Ethan continued. I believe my record speaks to the effectiveness of my command style. 22 years, thousands of flights, 0 accidents. The decisions made on Flight 101 were consistent with that record, prioritizing schedule integrity and operational efficiency within established safety parameters. He straightened slightly in his chair. I respect the board's authority to establish leadership expectations. If those expectations have evolved to prioritize different aspects of command, I'm willing to adapt accordingly. The careful wording, the passive voice, the conditional phrasing, the lack of direct accountability revealed more than any admission could have. Ethan had offered not contrition, but compliance, not insight, but accommodation. He hadn't acknowledged fault because fundamentally he didn't believe he was at fault. Alexander Harrington exchanged glances with Victoria and other board members, a silent communication passing between them. When he spoke, his tone had shifted from inquiry to judgment. "Thank you, Captain Blackwell. I think we've heard enough to make our determination." He folded his hands on the table. "Andrea, please proceed with the formal notification." Andrea Lawson. Apex's general counsel opened a sealed folder and removed an official document bearing the company letterhead and board seal. Captain Ethan Blackwell. She began her tone strictly professional after thorough review of evidence presented regarding Flight 101 and consideration of your prior record. The Executive Board of Apex Airlines has determined the following. She read directly from the document. Effective immediately, your employment with Apex Airlines is terminated for cause. The cause determination is based on multiple violations of company policy regarding safety procedures, crew resource management, customer care standards, and leadership expectations. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. Termination wasn't just a career setback. It was professional devastation. Pilots terminated for cause faced enormous hurdles finding comparable positions at other airlines. This is disproportionate, he managed, struggling to keep his voice steady. A single flight evaluation. This is not about a single flight, Alexander Harrington interrupted firmly. As we've established through extensive evidence, Flight 101 revealed a pattern of leadership behaviors inconsistent with Apex Airlines' values and safety culture. The Phoenix Initiative evaluation simply confirmed what multiple previous incidents had suggested. Andrea continued reading. In accordance with your employment contract termination for cause results in forfeiture of pending benefits, including consideration for advanced positions. Your company credentials must be surrendered immediately. Transportation security credentials will be suspended pending notification of relevant authorities. The formal sterile language did nothing to soften the devastating impact of each statement. Ethan's career, the identity he had built over decades, was being systematically dismantled in real time. But Andrea wasn't finished. Additionally, in accordance with federal aviation regulations and company safety protocols, Apex Airlines will file a comprehensive report with the Federal Aviation Administration regarding the incidents of Flight 101, including the CVR transcript, FDR data, and sworn testimony from crew members. This was the killing blow, the one that extended beyond Apex to threaten his very identity as a pilot. FAA reviews of this nature could result in license action requiring extensive retraining and psychological evaluation before reinstatement if reinstatement was granted at all. The report will detail your decision to proceed through severe weather. Despite multiple warnings, your dismissal of established procedures regarding the LGN temperature alert and your creation of a cockpit environment inconsistent with crew resource management principles. Andrea's clinical recitation continued. The board is formally recommending a full review of your ATP certification based on demonstrated judgment concerns. Ethan's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. 22 years of perfect evaluations, meticulous flying technical excellence, all erased by a judgment of character he hadn't even recognized was being made. Michael Sullivan, the chief pilot who had once been Ethan's mentor, spoke next, his voice heavy with a personal disappointment that cut deeper than the formal notification. Ethan, this isn't a decision anyone took lightly. I've known you since you were a first officer. I've defended your methods more times than I can count because your technical skills are beyond question. He sighed deeply. But being a captain, especially a captain at Apex, has never been just about handling an aircraft. It's about leadership judgment and representing our values. Sullivan pushed a folder across the table. This contains the formal paperwork regarding your separation from Apex. There's also information about the appeal process should you choose to pursue it. Ethan stared at the folder but made no move to take it. The reality of the situation was still sinking in the finality, the public nature of his fall, the comprehensive destruction of a career he had thought unassailable. Alexander Harrington stood, signaling that the formal proceedings were concluded. Captain Blackwell's security will escort you to HR to complete the necessary paperwork and surrender your credentials. Your personal belongings will be collected from your locker and delivered to your residence. As if on cue, the boardroom door opened and two corporate security officers entered, their expressions professionally neutral. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Ethan Blackwell, once the unquestioned master of his domain, was now a security risk to be managed. James Rivera couldn't meet Ethan's eyes as the former captain rose stiffly from his chair. Sophia Mendez looked down at her notes, her testimony having played a crucial role in the outcome, but taking no satisfaction in the result. Victoria Simmons watched with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen this scenario play out before hubris followed by inevitable fall. As Ethan moved toward the door, his posture still rigid with ingrained discipline, Alexander Harrington spoke one last time. "Ethan, for what it's worth, no one questions your abilities as a pilot. But Apex needs leaders, not just skilled technicians. The arrogance that made you dismiss a passenger at your cockpit door is the same arrogance that led you to dismiss weather warnings and crew concerns. That mindset has no place in modern aviation." Ethan paused at the door but didn't turn around. Without a word, he continued out of the boardroom, the security officers falling in step beside him. The door closed behind them with a soft but final click. In the sudden silence, Victoria Simmons closed her evaluation folder. The Phoenix Initiative has identified its first critical leadership gap. The question now is how we address the cultural factors that allowed this situation to develop in the first place. Alexander nodded soberly. "And who will lead our A380 program now that our primary candidate is no longer with the company?" As the board began discussing next steps, Ethan Blackwell was escorted to Human Resources, then to the security desk in the lobby. There, he surrendered his company ID, the credential that had given him access to cockpits around the world, watching as it was deactivated with a single swipe through a card reader. His fall was complete. The cockpit kingdom he had ruled so absolutely was gone, the crown taken, the throne empty. And as he stepped into the bright morning sunlight of Manhattan, Captain Ethan Blackwell ceased to exist, leaving only the man flawed, humbled, and suddenly facing a future without the identity that had defined him for more than 2 decades. Ethan Blackwell stood alone on the sidewalk outside Apex headquarters, the morning bustle of Manhattan continuing around him as if the world hadn't just collapsed. Business people hurried past tourists, gazed up at skyscrapers, and traffic inched forward, all oblivious to the professional execution that had just taken place 47 floors above them. His phone buzzed. A text from his father, retired Captain William Blackwell, the aviation legend whose shadow Ethan had spent his career trying to escape. "Call me immediately." Sullivan just phoned. Of course Michael had called his father. The two had been contemporaries, friends from the old days of aviation when pilots were treated like gods and customer service was considered the flight attendant's responsibility. His father would be furious not at Ethan but at Apex for daring to terminate his son over what the older generation would view as administrative nonsense. Ethan couldn't face that conversation yet. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and began walking with no particular destination in mind. 10 blocks later, he found himself in a nondescript coffee shop ordering automatically, then sitting in a corner booth away from other customers. The events in the boardroom replayed in his mind each moment, now painfully clear in retrospect. He should have acknowledged fault. He should have shown contrition. He should have promised to change. But those responses hadn't occurred to him because even now he struggled to see where his approach had been fundamentally wrong. The aircraft had landed safely. The turbulence, while uncomfortable, hadn't compromised structural integrity. The decisions had been technically sound. What he couldn't seem to grasp, what the board had tried to make him understand, was that technical soundness wasn't the only measure that mattered anymore. His coffee sat untouched as he stared out the window, his mind circling back to a question that had been implicit throughout the hearing. but never directly addressed. Why him? Why now? Apex had dozens of senior captains with similar command styles. What had made Ethan Blackwell the target of this sudden cultural revolution? The answer arrived with devastating clarity. 40 minutes later, when his phone rang with a call from Peter Donovan, a fellow captain who had been on the inside track for several promotions. "Ethan, I just heard. Jesus, I'm sorry. Everyone's in shock." "Word travels fast," Ethan replied flatly. "Sullivan called an emergency meeting with all the New York-based captains. He didn't give details, just said you were no longer with the company, and they'd be naming a new lead for the A380 program tomorrow." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. The A380 program? There was an awkward pause on the line. "You knew about that, right? You were the front runner for fleet captain. The whole pilot corps knew you were getting it." The coffee shop seemed to tilt around Ethan as the final piece fell into place. The A380 Apex's massive $10 billion investment in next-generation aircraft, the crown jewel of their fleet expansion. The fleet captain position would oversee the entire program, from acceptance flights to crew training to route development. It was the most prestigious position a line pilot could achieve short of moving into executive ranks. And it had been his. The position he had been working toward his entire career had been within his grasp, and now it was gone. "Ethan, you still there? I need to go, Peter." He ended the call, his mind reeling with the implications. The timing of the Phoenix Initiative. The selection of his flight for the first evaluation, Victoria Simmons's presence, it hadn't been random. They had been specifically assessing his suitability for the A380 position, and he had failed spectacularly. Not because of his flying skills, but because of something he had dismissed as secondary throughout his career. His leadership approach, his human touch, his alignment with corporate values. The irony was suffocating. The very traits he had cultivated to distinguish himself. Technical, perfectionism, operational, efficiency, unwavering confidence had ultimately disqualified him from the position that would have cemented his legacy in aviation. Ethan's phone rang again. His father for the third time. He finally answered, knowing he couldn't avoid the conversation forever. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" William Blackwell's voice was exactly as Ethan expected, indignant, angry, protective. "Sullivan tells me they've terminated you over some nonsense about passenger greeting and turbulence. This is outrageous. I'm calling Alexander directly." "Don't," Ethan interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "It's done, Dad. And it's not what you think. What I think is that the airline your father helped build has lost its mind. Firing a pilot of your caliber over customer service complaints? In my day, it's not your day anymore." Ethan cut in, a lifetime of deference to his father, suddenly giving way to brutal clarity. "It's not even my day, apparently. The world changed, and I didn't change with it." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. William Blackwell had never heard his son speak this way, with resignation rather than defiance, insight rather than defense. "They were going to make me fleet captain for the A380 program?" Ethan continued the words like ash in his mouth. "It was lined up, ready to announce. Then they sent a board member to evaluate me, and I showed them exactly who I've always been: technically flawless and humanly flawed." His father's response was quieter now, the initial rage giving way to concern. "Ethan, what exactly happened up there?" For the first time, Ethan described the events of Flight 101 without technical justifications or dismissals. He recounted Victoria at the cockpit door, the LGN alert, the weather decision, the passenger injuries, all of it. As he spoke, he began to see the pattern that had been invisible to him in the moment, but glaringly obvious to everyone in that boardroom. The board meeting was just a formality, he concluded. They had already made their decision. "I failed their test in every way possible. William Blackwell sighed heavily. "When I pinned those captain's wings on your chest, I told you something my own father told me. A pilot's record is meaningless if his character is flawed." Ethan finished the words coming back to him from that proud day decades ago. "I thought it was about honesty, about integrity in reporting. I didn't realize it was about how you treat people." The conversation ended shortly after with none of the fire and indignation that Ethan had expected. Instead, there was something worse. His father's profound disappointment not in Apex Airlines, but in the son who had failed to understand the most fundamental lesson of command. As Ethan finally left the coffee shop, his phone buzzed with an incoming email. From habit, he checked it, then froze in the middle of the sidewalk as he read the subject line, "Apex Airlines announces James Rivera as A380 Fleet Captain." The press release had already gone out. The final twist of the knife was complete. James Rivera, the first officer he had dismissed as inexperienced and overly cautious, would now lead the program that should have been Ethan's crowning achievement. The announcement praised Rivera's exemplary leadership qualities, commitment to safety culture, and alignment with Apex's core values of respect, collaboration, and excellence. It mentioned his demonstrated ability to balance operational efficiency with passenger comfort and crew welfare, a direct rebuke of Ethan's command philosophy without ever naming him. As pedestrians flowed around him on the busy sidewalk, Ethan Blackwell experienced something entirely new in his professional life, the complete collapse of certainty. Everything he had believed about his career, his superiority, his inevitability, his rightness, lay shattered at his feet. The irony was absolute. The man who refused to acknowledge a passenger at his cockpit door had just lost everything to that same passenger. The captain who dismissed his first officer's concerns would now watch that first officer take the position that should have been his. The leader who prioritized technical perfection over human connection had been judged and found wanting not for his flying, but for his humanity. In aviation, they called it karmic justice, the cosmic balancing of accounts that sometimes occurred when arrogance met reality. Ethan had seen it happen to others, and had always privately judged them for their failures. Now he was living it, and the perfect symmetry of his fall was both undeniable and devastating. As the reality of his new circumstances settled over him, Ethan Blackwell, former captain, former rising star, former heir. A parent began the long walk home, his future as uncertain as the cloudy Manhattan sky above him. The following days passed in a surreal blur for Ethan Blackwell. The routine that had structured his life for decades. The predictable rhythm of flight schedules, pre-trip preparations, crew briefings was suddenly gone, leaving a void that seemed to expand with each passing hour. His phone, once constantly buzzing with company communications and crew coordination, fell eerily silent. Former colleagues maintained a respectful distance, some out of awkwardness, others from fear of association with a fallen star. The pilot community was small and news traveled fast. By now, everyone knew what had happened to Captain Ethan Blackwell. On the third day after his termination, the formal letter from the FAA arrived. The regulatory body was initiating a review of his airline transport pilot certificate based on the report submitted by Apex Airlines. His medical certification would remain valid, but his privileges to operate as a commercial pilot were suspended pending completion of the review, a process that could take months. The letter outlined the specific concerns, demonstrated judgment issues related to weather avoidance decisions, failure to follow established procedures regarding systems alerts, and crew resource management deficiencies, creating an unsafe operating environment. Each phrase was a professional dagger precisely targeted at the foundation of his identity as a pilot. That evening, Ethan found himself standing in his home office staring at the wall of framed credentials and awards that chronicled his aviation career, his ATP certificate now effectively suspended, his type ratings on 5 different aircraft, his perfect attendance awards. The framed article from Aviation Week profiling him as one of the industry's rising stars a decade ago, and in the center most prominently displayed the photograph of his father pinning captain's wings on his uniform 20 years earlier. William Blackwell's expression in that moment, fierce pride mingled with solemn expectation, had been a driving force throughout Ethan's career. Never disappoint, never show weakness, never be second best. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed William Blackwell, and Ethan answered immediately, despite the dread pooling in his stomach. "Hello, Dad." "Oh?" There was a long pause before his father spoke. "I talked to Bill Sinsky today." Ethan tensed. Sinsky had been his father's co-pilot decades ago before rising to become Apex's director of flight standards, one of the executives who had sat silently in that boardroom as Ethan's career was dismantled. "What did he say?" Ethan asked, though he could guess. "Everything." His father's voice sounded older, wearier than Ethan had ever heard it. "He played me the cockpit recordings, Ethan. He showed me the weather data. He walked me through the whole damn thing." Ethan closed his eyes, leaning against his desk for support. This was the judgment he had feared most, not from the board, not from the FAA, but from the man whose approval had shaped his entire life. "Dad, I can explain. Can you?" William Blackwell interrupted his tone, not angry, but profoundly disappointed. "Can you explain ignoring direct warnings from air traffic control? Can you explain dismissing your first officer when he tried to follow proper procedures? Can you explain calling injured passengers, people looking for vouchers?" The questions hung in the air, each one exposing the hollowness of any potential defense. "I flew planes held together with rivets and prayers." His father continued, his voice softening, but no less devastating. "But I never not once forgot that my first duty was to the safety and comfort of the people who trusted me with their lives. I never forgot that the person sitting beside me in the cockpit was my partner, not my subordinate." Ethan had no response. For perhaps the first time he was hearing his father speak not as the aviation legend, whose legacy he had tried to uphold, but as a man expressing genuine disappointment in choices that couldn't be excused by technical skill. "A pilot's wings aren't just pinned to your uniform, son," William said after a long silence. "They're earned every day, with every decision, with every interaction. You didn't just lose a job yesterday. You disgraced the wings I pinned on your chest myself." The line went dead, leaving Ethan alone with the weight of his father's judgment, a burden heavier than any corporate disciplinary action or regulatory review could ever be. The days that followed brought practical realities crashing down. His attorney advised that appealing the termination would likely be futile given the evidence. The FAA review would require extensive retraining, psychological evaluation, and a demonstration of reformed judgment before reinstatement would be considered a process that typically took 12-18 months, if successful at all. Even if he regained his ATP privileges, the termination for cause from Apex created a nearly insurmountable barrier to employment with other major carriers. Airlines were risk-averse by nature, and a pilot dismissed for judgment issues represented a risk no mainstream carrier would easily accept. Ethan began reaching out to contacts throughout the industry, testing the waters for potential positions. The responses were uniformly polite and uniformly negative. Former colleagues who had once sought his mentorship now couldn't find time to return his calls. Airlines that had previously recruited him now had no suitable positions available. The aviation community, which had been his entire world for more than 2 decades, had closed ranks. Not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. A pilot who had demonstrated Ethan's judgment flaws was a liability that neither individual pilots nor corporate entities could afford to embrace. Meanwhile, at Apex headquarters, the Phoenix Initiative continued its work. Under Victoria Simmons' guidance, the program expanded to evaluate leadership quality across all senior captains. James Rivera's appointment as A380 Fleet Captain was officially announced with glowing endorsements from Alexander Harrington and Michael Sullivan. The press release emphasized Rivera's collaborative leadership style and commitment to developing the next generation of Apex pilots' qualities that stood in stark contrast to Ethan's command approach without ever naming him directly. Behind the scenes, Sofia Mendez was promoted to Director of Cabin Safety Training, a position that gave her significant influence over the integration of flight deck and cabin crew procedures, addressing exactly the communication gaps that had been exposed during Flight 101. The message throughout Apex was clear technical skill remained essential, but leadership quality had become equally important in determining who would advance and who would not. As these changes unfolded, Ethan's financial reality began to bite, with no income substantial. Manhattan living expenses and legal fees mounting for his FAA certificate defense, his savings would sustain him for months, not years. He would need to find any employment within the aviation industry soon. After weeks of rejections from mainstream carriers, Ethan expanded his search to regional airlines, charter operations, and flight schools. The responses remained discouraging until finally a small cargo outfit operating in Alaska expressed interest not as a captain, not even as a first officer, but as a basic line pilot on their oldest aircraft. The offer letter arrived with terms that would have been unthinkable just a month earlier, a salary less than a third of what he had earned at Apex, no guaranteed schedule, minimal benefits, and a 6-month probationary period during which he could be terminated without cause. Ethan stared at the document for a long time, the choice before him stark and humbling. Accept these terms and salvage some semblance of a flying career, or hold out hope for a better opportunity that might never materialize. In the end, there was no real choice at all. Flying was the only professional identity he had ever known, the only skill set he had ever developed. Even in diminished form, it was preferable to abandoning aviation entirely. He signed the contract, packed the few possessions he would need in the harsh Alaskan environment, and prepared to leave the life he had built in New York. His luxury apartment would be rented out. He couldn't afford to maintain it on his new salary, but couldn't bear to sell it and admit the permanence of his fall. On his last night in the city, Ethan stood at his window overlooking the Manhattan skyline, the lights of aircraft moving through the darkness above. Somewhere up there, pilots he had once commanded were continuing their careers, flying the routes he had mastered, living the life that had been his. And tomorrow he would begin his exile, not just geographical, but professional. From commanding the world's most advanced aircraft on prestigious international routes to flying aging cargo planes through some of the most dangerous conditions on Earth. The symmetry of his situation wasn't lost on him. He had spent a career prioritizing technical skill over human connection, dismissing those he deemed less capable, creating a command environment where his word was absolute. Now he would fly in complete isolation, his technical skills his only companion, his cockpit kingdom reduced to the cramped confines of a half-century-old cargo hauler. Ethan Blackwell had finally achieved the sterile cockpit he had always valued, but not in the way he had ever imagined. As he turned away from the window, the realization settled like a physical weight. This wasn't just a career setback. This was exile punishment, and perhaps most fittingly, the natural consequence of the very philosophy he had championed throughout his career. 6 months after his termination from Apex, Ethan Blackwell stood on the frozen tarmac of a remote Alaskan airfield, his breath forming clouds in the bitter February air. Before him sat his current command, a Douglas DC-6 manufactured in 1958, decades before Ethan himself was born. Its 4 piston engines, massive propellers caked with ice at their tips, represented aviation technology from an entirely different era. Northern Freight Operations had hired him after his FAA certificate restrictions were modified to allow limited commercial flying under supervision. The modification had come with strict conditions. He could only operate specific older aircraft, must fly with an approved check pilot for his first 500 hours, and was prohibited from passenger operations of any kind. These restrictions effectively limited him to cargo operations in remote regions where the demand for even disgraced pilots exceeded the supply of qualified aviators. Alaska, with its challenging weather, dangerous terrain, and critical dependence on air transport, was one of the few places willing to give him a chance. Pre-flight's complete captain announced Mitch Hendricks his co-pilot and FAA-mandated supervisor. At 63, Mitch had been flying these routes for over 30 years, his weathered face and calm demeanor testament to a lifetime of bush flying experience. Ethan nodded, surveying the cargo strapped down in the aircraft's cavernous interior drilling equipment supplies and mail bound for a remote oil field camp 300 miles north. The load was close to maximum weight, the margins for error slim given the forecast conditions. "Weather update," Ethan asked, his voice muffled by the thick scarf protecting his face from temperatures hovering around -30. "Deteriorating," Mitch replied matter-of-factly. Ceiling dropping to about 800 feet, visibility down to 2 miles in snow, winds gusting to 40 knots at destination. 6 months ago, flying a state-of-the-art Dreamliner, Ethan would have had satellite weather uplinks, precision forecasts, and multiple diversion options. Now he had basic radio reports, his own judgment, and the stark knowledge that misjudging the conditions could be fatal. "Let's go," he decided after a brief consideration. "We can turn back if conditions worsen." The interior of the DC-6 bore no resemblance to the gleaming cockpits Ethan had commanded at Apex. Analog gauges dominated the panel, many with faded markings and hairline cracks in their glass. The control yokes were massive by modern standards, requiring physical strength rather than fingertip pressure to maneuver the aircraft. Everything about the machine was louder, heavier, and more demanding than the fly-by-wire systems he had mastered over his career. The startup sequence was an orchestrated ballet of mechanical systems, each engine coughing to life with belches of black smoke before settling into a thunderous roar. The entire airframe vibrated with their power, a visceral reminder of the raw forces involved in keeping 30 tons of metal airborne. As they taxied toward the runway, Ethan reflected on the brutal irony of his situation. He had finally achieved the sterile cockpit he had always valued: no passengers to consider, no flight attendants to coordinate, with no customer service considerations to balance against operational efficiency. Just the pure technical challenge of flying a difficult aircraft through challenging conditions. Yet this sterility brought no satisfaction. It was exile, not elevation. "Your aircraft," Mitch announced as they lined up for takeoff following the protocol they had established. Despite being technically the supervising pilot, Mitch respected the command structure enough to let Ethan handle most of the flying. "My aircraft," Ethan confirmed, advancing the throttles with careful precision. The takeoff roll was agonizingly long compared to the Dreamliner's powerful leap into the sky. The DC-6 lumbered down the runway, gathering speed reluctantly before finally breaking free of gravity's hold and climbing ponderously into the gray Alaskan sky. As they established their cruise altitude, a mere 8,000 feet compared to the 40,000 feet Ethan had once commanded, the weather closed in around them. Snow reduced visibility to a gray void, punctuated only by the occasional glimpse of the jagged terrain below. The aircraft bucked and yawed in the turbulent air, requiring constant attention to maintain course and altitude. "How's it compare to that Dreamliner you used to fly?" Mitch asked, after they had settled into the cruise, his tone curious rather than mocking. Ethan adjusted the mixture controls before answering. "Different world. The 787 practically flies itself. This machine, you have to fly it every second." Mitch nodded. "That's why I stayed with these old birds. Modern planes, they hide the flying behind computers. Up here, it's still just you, the machine, and the elements." The observation struck Ethan as profound. Throughout his career at Apex, he had prided himself on his technical mastery, his ability to manage the incredibly complex systems of modern aircraft. But here, flying this mechanical dinosaur through some of the most dangerous conditions on Earth, he was experiencing a more fundamental form of aviation, one where survival depended not on systems management, but on raw piloting skill and judgment. Weather station reports conditions deteriorating at destination, Mitch announced after a radio call, sealing down to 500 feet visibility less than a mile. Your call, Captain. Here was the test not just of Ethan's flying skills, but of the judgment that had been found so wanting at Apex. The old Ethan would have pushed forward confident in his abilities, dismissive of cautionary input. The payload was valuable, the client important, the schedule commitment significant. But those priorities had cost him everything once before. Ethan studied the charts, considering their fuel reserves, alternate landing sites, and the rapidly deteriorating conditions. The decision matrix was complex, but the lesson from Flight 101 was painfully clear. "We're diverting to Fairbanks," he announced. "Conditions are beyond safe limits, and we're carrying enough fuel for the alternate." Something that might have been approval flickered across Mitch's weathered face. "Agreed. I'll notify operations." The decision would cost the company money. It would inconvenience the clients. It would disrupt schedules and create logistical challenges. But unlike that fateful day over the Atlantic, Ethan was now prioritizing safety over efficiency, caution over confidence. As they banked toward their diversion airport, the irony wasn't lost on Ethan. He had come full circle from dismissing weather warnings in a state-of-the-art aircraft to heeding them in a mechanical relic. From commanding prestigious routes to hauling cargo through the wilderness. From the pinnacle of aviation to its margins. Yet in this exile, this professional purgatory, he was finally learning what 22 years at Apex had failed to teach him, that true command wasn't about asserting authority, but about exercising judgment. That leadership wasn't measured by technical skill alone, but by the wisdom to know when those skills weren't enough. The DC-6 descended through turbulent air toward Fairbanks, its aging airframe groaning under the stress. Ethan's hands remained steady on the controls, his focus absolute. He was still an exceptional pilot, still capable of managing complex aircraft in challenging conditions. But he was no longer the same captain who had dismissed Victoria Simmons at his cockpit door 6 months earlier. That man had believed in his own infallibility, had confused technical skill with leadership quality, had prioritized efficiency over humanity. This man, older in spirit, if not in years, recognized his limitations, respected the input of others, and understood that sometimes the best command decision was to change course. As the runway lights appeared through the swirling snow, Ethan prepared for landing, the weight of his exile heavy but oddly clarifying. He had lost everything, career, reputation, identity, but in that loss he had gained something he hadn't known. He was missing perspective. Whether that perspective would ever translate into redemption remained to be seen. For now, as the ancient Douglas settled onto the snow-covered runway with a bone-jarring thump, Ethan Blackwell was simply grateful to have completed another flight safely, a humbler metric of success than he had once measured himself by, but perhaps a more meaningful one. 1 year after Flight 101, the executive boardroom at Apex Airlines headquarters was once again filled with the company's senior leadership. The atmosphere, however, could not have been more different from the tense tribunal that had ended Ethan Blackwell's career. Today's gathering had the energy of celebration of transformation successfully navigated. Alexander Harrington stood at the head of the table, gesturing toward a presentation screen displaying the company's latest performance metrics. "The numbers tell a compelling story," he announced to the assembled executives. "Customer satisfaction up 22% across all routes. Safety reporting increased by 38%. Crew retention improved by 15%. And perhaps most significantly, our operational incident rate has dropped to the lowest level in company history." He clicked to the next slide, which showed the Apex logo alongside the distinctive silhouette of the Airbus A380. And all of this while successfully launching our A380 program on schedule, under budget, with the highest safety ratings in initial certification. Victoria Simmons, now settled into her role on the board, watched with quiet satisfaction. The Phoenix Initiative. Her evaluation program that had begun with Ethan Blackwell's flight had expanded into a comprehensive leadership development strategy that touched every aspect of Apex's operations. None of this would have been possible without fundamental culture change, Victoria commented, addressing the group. And that change began with a single difficult decision to prioritize leadership quality over technical skill alone. Michael Sullivan, the chief pilot who had once mentored Ethan Blackwell, nodded in agreement. The ripple effects have been remarkable. When our most senior captains understood that leadership behavior actually matters to advancement, the shift in cockpit culture was almost immediate. At the opposite end of the table from where Ethan had once sat in judgment, sat James Rivera, now in his role as A380 fleet captain. At 33, he was the youngest pilot ever to hold such a senior position at Apex, his rapid rise a testament to the company's new priorities. Captain Rivera Alexander directed his attention to James. Perhaps you could share some insights from the A380 program launch. James straightened slightly, still not entirely comfortable in the executive setting despite a year in the role. The technical aspects of the launch have been challenging but manageable. What's been most significant, I think, is how we've integrated leadership development into every aspect of the training program. He gestured to his tablet, sharing data with the room's main screen. Every A380 captain candidate now undergoes comprehensive leadership evaluation alongside technical certification. We've created cockpit culture workshops, implemented regular crew feedback sessions, and established mentoring relationships between senior and junior pilots. Sophia Mendez, who had been promoted to Director of Cabin Safety Integration following Flight 101, added her perspective. The transformation in crew communication has been extraordinary. The artificial barrier between flight deck and cabin crew has largely disappeared. We're now truly operating as one team rather than two separate domains. Victoria observed these reports with particular interest. The Phoenix Initiative had begun as a targeted evaluation of problematic leadership, but it had evolved into something far more profound, a fundamental reimagining of what aviation leadership meant in the modern era. I'd like to share something remarkable, Victoria said, opening her portfolio. We've been tracking specific metrics on passenger experience and safety reporting. The correlation between leadership quality scores and operational outcomes is statistically significant. She displayed graphs showing the relationship between various leadership behaviors and key performance indicators. Captains who score highest on our collaboration and communication metrics also show the lowest rates of operational incidents and the highest passenger satisfaction scores. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. The data confirms what we suspected all along, that technical excellence without leadership quality isn't just a culture problem. It's a business problem and a safety problem. The discussion continued, focusing on the next phases of implementation and the lessons learned from the A380 program launch. Throughout the meeting, Ethan Blackwell's name was never mentioned directly, but his shadow lingered in the room, the cautionary example that had catalyzed this transformation. After the meeting concluded, James and Victoria remained behind, continuing their conversation about leadership development initiatives for the expanding A380 fleet. "Have you heard anything about him?" James asked quietly, the subject obvious without needing to be named. Victoria nodded slightly. "Last I heard, he's still flying cargo in Alaska. The FAA restored his full ATP privileges 3 months ago, but he hasn't applied to any major carriers." "Do you think he ever understood why it happened? Not just the termination, but the whole evaluation?" "I don't know," Victoria admitted. "Some pilots of his generation never truly grasp that the world has changed, that commanding an aircraft is about more than technical skill and authority." James considered this. "It's strange. He was such an exceptional pilot in so many ways. The most precise approaches, the most efficient fuel management, the most comprehensive systems knowledge I've ever seen. And yet Victoria replied gently, what ultimately mattered wasn't what he could do with the aircraft, but how he led the people inside it. As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave, James paused by the boardroom window looking out over the Manhattan skyline, where Apex's newest A380 was visible, making its approach to JFK sunlight glinting off its massive fuselage. The irony is that so much of what I know about flying I learned from him, James reflected. But everything I know about leadership I learned from watching what happened to him. Victoria stood beside him, watching the aircraft's graceful descent. That may be his most important legacy, though not the one he intended. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from failure rather than success. Across the country in the frozen wilderness of Alaska, Ethan Blackwell completed the pre-flight checks on his DC-6 cargo hauler. The aircraft was the same aging, demanding, unforgiving. But the man commanding it had changed profoundly. The year in exile had stripped away layers of arrogance and certainty, replacing them with humility and perspective that had once seemed unnecessary to his understanding of command. He now flew with a different awareness, not just of the aircraft and environment, but of his place within the larger system of aviation. His FAA restrictions had been lifted after extensive retraining and psychological evaluation, opening the possibility of return to mainstream commercial aviation. Several regional carriers had expressed interest, willing to give a pilot of his technical caliber a second chance. Yet Ethan had declined these opportunities, choosing instead to remain in the harsh simplicity of cargo operations. Here in the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness, the consequences of decisions were immediate and undeniable. Here there was no room for ego or arrogance, only competence, judgment, and respect for the elements. As he settled into the captain's seat, preparing for another challenging flight through difficult conditions, Ethan Blackwell was not the man he had once been. The fall from aviation's heights had been devastating, but in that devastation, something unexpected had emerged, a humbler, wiser pilot who understood that command was a responsibility rather than a privilege. Whether redemption would ever come in a professional sense remained uncertain. But in the frozen cockpit of this aging cargo hauler, far from the prestigious routes and advanced aircraft he had once commanded, Ethan Blackwell had found a different kind of redemption. The quiet knowledge that he now understood what had eluded him throughout his meteoric career. Leadership wasn't about rank or technical skill. It was about character. And sometimes character was revealed not in success, but in how one responded to failure. 2 years after the fateful Flight 101, Alexander Harrington stood before a packed auditorium at the International Aviation Leadership Symposium in Geneva. As keynote speaker, the Apex Airlines chairman had been asked to address the theme of the conference, Redefining Excellence in Modern Aviation. The audience comprised airline executives, regulatory officials, training specialists, and senior pilots from carriers around the world, the decision-makers who would shape aviation's future. Among them sat Victoria Simmons, James Rivera, and Sofia Mendez, representing Apex's transformed leadership approach. For decades, Harrington began. The aviation industry has operated on a fundamental assumption that technical excellence is the primary measure of pilot quality. We've built selection processes, training programs, and advancement criteria around this assumption. And in doing so, we've perpetuated a dangerous imbalance. He clicked to his first slide showing the traditional aviation hierarchy, a pyramid with technical skills at the base building upward through procedural compliance and systems knowledge with leadership qualities relegated to a small segment at the very top. This model served us well in aviation's earlier eras when aircraft were less reliable and technical mastery was often the difference between safety and disaster. But modern aviation has evolved. Today's aircraft are marvels of engineering redundancy. Systems failures, while still serious, rarely lead to catastrophic outcomes. Harrington clicked to the next slide showing accident statistics over the past 30 years. The data is clear. When we examine modern aviation incidents, we find that human factors, specifically leadership failures, communication breakdowns, and crew resource management issues, are implicated in over 70% of cases. Meanwhile, purely technical failures account for less than 15%. He paused, allowing this reality to sink in for the audience of aviation professionals. At Apex Airlines, we learned this lesson through a profound organizational failure, our decades-long practice of promoting and celebrating technical excellence without equal emphasis on leadership quality. The Phoenix Initiative was born from that recognition, and its impact has transformed our entire operation. Victoria watched from her seat in the front row, reflecting on the journey from that first evaluation flight to this moment. What had begun as a targeted assessment of one problematic captain had evolved into a comprehensive reimagining of aviation leadership for an entire industry. Let me be clear. Harrington continued. Technical excellence remains essential, but it is no longer sufficient. The modern aviation environment demands a new definition of pilot excellence, one that integrates technical skill with leadership quality in equal measure. He revealed the new model Apex had developed a circular integration of technical competence, procedural discipline, communication skills, emotional intelligence, and leadership behavior. No single element dominated. All were essential components of the complete aviator. We've redesigned our entire pilot development pathway around this integrated model, Harrington explained. From initial hiring through training evaluation and advancement, we now assess and develop the whole pilot, not just their handling skills or systems knowledge. In the audience, James Rivera listened with particular interest. As A380 fleet captain, he had been at the forefront of implementing these changes. His appointment, coming directly after Ethan Blackwell's termination, had sent a powerful message throughout Apex leadership quality wasn't optional. It was essential. The results speak for themselves. Harrington continued displaying Apex's performance metrics over the past 2 years. Safety incidents down 42%. Customer satisfaction up 28%. Pilot retention improved by 22%. Even our operational efficiency, traditionally the justification for the old approach, has improved by 14%. The chairman advanced to a slide showing the Apex A380 program statistics. Our flagship A380 operation, led by Captain James Rivera and his leadership team, has established new industry benchmarks for safety efficiency and customer experience. Not because they're flying the aircraft better in a technical sense, but because they're leading their teams better in a human sense. James felt a momentary discomfort at being highlighted this way. He remained acutely aware that his opportunity had come through another pilot's downfall. Though he never spoke of it publicly, he still occasionally thought of Ethan Blackwell, the technically brilliant captain whose leadership failures had created the vacancy James now filled. Harrington's presentation continued detailing specific initiatives Apex had implemented, from their revised selection criteria to their leadership development programs, from their crew communication protocols to their customer experience metrics. Throughout, the message remained consistent. Technical skill and leadership quality were equally essential to aviation excellence. As the presentation concluded, Harrington delivered his final challenge to the industry leaders assembled before him. The question facing each of us isn't whether technical excellence matters. Of course it does. The question is whether we continue to pretend that leadership quality is secondary or optional. The data, the experience, and increasingly the regulatory environment all tell us it is not. He paused, scanning the room of aviation decision-makers. At Apex Airlines, we learned this lesson through a painful process that cost careers and nearly compromised safety. I challenge each of you to learn from our experience rather than repeat it. Redefine excellence in your organizations before circumstances force that redefinition upon you. The applause was enthusiastic but thoughtful, the response of professionals confronting uncomfortable truths about their industry's culture. As attendees filed out for the networking reception, Many approached the Apex delegation with questions seeking more details about their transformation process. During a quiet moment at the reception, Victoria found herself standing with James near a window overlooking Geneva's beautiful lake. "Do you ever wonder about him?" James asked, not needing to specify whom he meant. Victoria nodded slightly. "Not about whether the decision was right, I'm certain it was, but about whether he ever truly understood the lesson. I checked on him recently," James admitted. "He's still in Alaska, though he's moved up to a regional passenger carrier there. Chief pilot for a small operation serving remote communities. By all accounts, he's different. More measured, more collaborative." "Redemption comes in unexpected forms," Victoria observed. "Sometimes losing everything is the only way to gain perspective." James considered this. "Do you think our industry is actually ready for this change?" "There are a lot of Ethan Blackwells still commanding aircraft around the world." "Change never happens all at once," Victoria replied. "But once it begins, once the data becomes irrefutable, evolution becomes inevitable." Look around this room 2 years ago, most of these executives would have dismissed leadership quality as secondary. Now they're asking how to measure and develop it. As the evening continued, the conversations throughout the reception reflected this shifting paradigm. Technical directors discussing emotional intelligence metrics, chief pilots debating leadership development strategies, training managers exchanging notes on crew resource management techniques. A transformation was beginning, sparked by one airline's painful lesson but potentially benefiting the entire industry. The Phoenix Initiative had indeed lived up to its name from the ashes of a failed leadership model. A new approach was rising, one that recognized a fundamental truth in modern aviation: how you lead is as important as how you fly. And somewhere in the Alaskan wilderness, Ethan Blackwell was learning this same truth one flight at a time in the humbling solitude of a cockpit far removed from the prestige he had once known, but perhaps closer to the essence of true command than he had ever been before. As we conclude this powerful story, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever worked with or under someone like Ethan Blackwell? Someone technically brilliant but humanly flawed? Or perhaps in some area of your life, have you been that person yourself? The lessons from Flight 101 extend far beyond the cockpit. They speak to universal truths about leadership that apply in every workplace, every relationship, every domain where humans must work together toward common goals. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share it with others who might benefit from its message. Drop a comment about your own experiences with technical excellence versus human leadership. I read every comment and would love to hear your perspective. And remember, in any field, not just aviation, how we treat people matters just as much as how well we perform our technical tasks. True excellence requires both. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore another powerful true story that changed lives and organizations forever.